Welcome everybody to the International Forum on Transition, hosted by the Institute on Community Integration at the University of Minnesota, in collaboration with many partners. This is a really exciting opportunity for us because this is the first time, and Janet will elaborate on this, where we are doing a forum based on our flagship publication called Impact. I'm also especially excited because one of our work at ICI focuses on global rights and inclusion. And so this really fits under that umbrella. And so I'm especially excited to welcome speakers and participants from around the world. Representing many countries, including Bhutan, Japan, Spain, and many others. And so we will, how this is going to go today, we'll have introductory remarks from David Jones, Janet Stewart, and then Lindsay Horowitz and Alyssa Klein. And then we'll follow the schedule. As you all know, we have pretty tight time slots. So it's pretty much 10 minutes per speaker, plus 2 minutes for transition between speakers and potentially one question. If there are more questions for the speakers, I encourage you to do two things. One is contact the speaker directly by email. Which is in the Impact. There is contact information for all of the articles. Or you can use the chat, but please don't overuse it because in the tight schedule, it's hard to monitor. Any other housekeeping? I do want to thank Nick Fernholz, who is the events coordinator for ICI, without whom this and many other events will not be possible. And with that, I want to invite Janet Stewart to say a few words.
Thanks, Renata, and good morning, everyone. It's great to have you with us both here and online. And just wanted to add my welcome to Renata's 35 years ago. Impact started as a little black and white newsletter. And even though we look very different today, the articles, as you look back over the years, have really been really compelling ways to get the message of inclusion through the disability community, whether that's families, whether that's practitioners, whether that's academics. And so that is what Impact is really all about. It's bringing communities together to talk about the latest advances in the field, to tell the personal stories of people who are living this day to day, and to offer a few tips and hints on things to try in whatever sort of walk you are in the disability community. So with that, I just wanted to say I'm really excited about this live event today. I think it's going to be the first of many, and we really look forward to your feedback and the continued relationship. So, Renata.
Thank you, Janet. And I also want to acknowledge the guest editors for the issue on transition in the global context. So if you could please come up, those who are here. So Jan Shishka, Brian Avery, and also Roger Stancliffe, who is online. So I don't know if you want to say a few words or keep the remarks. We have a slot at the end of the panel.
Yeah, we'll keep them very brief. One of the things I'd like to say is that this has been an amazing experience learning about how transition is handled across the globe, not just in the United States. And I think what we hope we will all experience today is kind of a sharing of learnings, what works, what hasn't worked, and we can go forward. Yeah.
Well, just very shortly, it has been a very nice experience, and thank you all the contributors from different countries, and particularly to those who are having a hard time in Ukraine. It's a remarkable achievement, and thank you again.
All right. And Roger, would you like to say a few words?
I just concur with Brian, and I think the diversity of approaches from around the world is very interesting and gives us wherever we are in the world, lots of food for thought and some alternatives to consider.
All right, thank you. So I just want to welcome the first speaker who is going to provide introductory remarks. It's a great pleasure to introduce David Jones from the Administration on Community Living, an agency that has funded our project of national significance on transition. David?
Thank you. Hello, I'm David Jones. I'm from the Administration for Community Living, and I serve as the Director of the Office of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. It is really nice to join this global community and help kick off this meeting. While we may be miles apart, we are truly a community of one, and I want to thank the University of Minnesota for being a convener. As we kick off the month of October, I would like to share with you that the U.S. is celebrating National Disability Employment Awareness Month. It's an annual observance that happens each October to celebrate the contributions of people with disabilities in the workforce. This month's theme is disability, part of the equity equation. I would like to begin remarks in providing a macro picture how equity is part of the equation. As many of you may know, in the US, we have 3 branches of government, and they have established a bedrock foundation to ensure people with disabilities, including youth with disabilities, have equal rights. A leading legislative milestone is the Americans with Disabilities Act. When the ADA was signed into law in 1990, our nation recognized and codified the fundamental principle that people with disabilities have the right to full participation in their communities. And in 1999, 9 years after the ADA was passed, the ADA's integration mandate was the basis for the Supreme Court's landmark Olmstead decision. That decision made it clear that community living is a civil right. The impact was that there was a shift from reliance on institutional setting to ensure individual needs are met by providing reasonable accommodations in their communities. And in 2000, the Developmental Disabilities and Bill of Rights Assistance Act, which we often call the DD Act, was reauthorized to empower individuals with developmental disabilities and their families to help shape policies that impact them. And this legislation formed the framework of what we know today as the DD network that exists in each state and territory. These are just a few examples of how our governing institutions shaped our national values and daily norms in the communities we live today. Over time, more people with disabilities are living self-determined lives in the community. More people with disabilities are working alongside people without disabilities as valued co-workers and paid fair wages. But as we all know, to effect true change, it takes time, and we recognize the work is not done. At the Administration for Community Living, we recognize we still have barriers to remove to advance these legislative milestones. And at ACL, we invest in our communities to advance these larger principles to achieve equity and impact. I would like to share some background about the Administration for Community Living, which we often know as ACL. ACL funds and administers a range of programs, centers, and national networks to support community living and inclusion for people with disabilities and older adults. Each year, our Aging and Disability Network serve over 10 million people in every state and territory. ACL Disability Network plays an important role in providing direct services, legal advocacy, and system change for people with disabilities and their families in various areas, including housing, education, transportation. But that's just a few of the areas in which we invest and advocate for. But due to limited time, I would like to focus my remarks on how we are advancing competitive integrated employment. Competitive integrated employment is a high priority for ACL because it's critical to inclusion both within the broader community and with coworkers. Employment is not just about a job. It is about having a career and working towards a better quality of life. At ACL, we sincerely believe that when people with disabilities have careers, they are on a path to economic security and independence. They are also happier and healthier. And I want to briefly take some time to drill down further to share how ACL is making strategic investment to spark change in communities across the US. One way ACL moves the needle is through our federal grant authority to states and communities to affect system change. One such grant is the Community Collaboration for Employment. These grants are designed to fund broader stakeholder collaboration that will increase community capacity to facilitate a more seamless transition of youth with developmental disabilities between schools and the community. The host of today's webinar, the University of Minnesota USED, is one of 7 grantees awarded the 5-year grant starting in 2021. The university received this grant to increase access to competitive integrated employment for youth with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And what we are so pleased to see is how University of Minnesota is innovatively using data to affect change. It is utilizing a pre-existing data collection system known as the Minnesota Statewide Longitudinal Education Data System to match student data obtained from pre-kindergarten through post-secondary education and then into the workforce. And also, the university, through active collaboration with community partners, is promoting a person-centered approach by recognizing the value of customized employment. Another way ACL seeks to affect change is by doing creative outreach to employers to support the federal-private partnership. ACL developed a Pride Challenge competition called Inclusive Talent Pipeline for American Business Challenge that was open to employers to bring their best ideas forward to address systemic problems. It is often said, if you build it, they will come. And after ACL developed this Pride Challenge, we received over 50 applications. Last year, we announced the winner of a $100,000 Pride Challenge to a business that successfully developed a digital hiring platform to connect recruiters and neurodiverse applicants through a more personalized and comprehensive screening tool so individuals with disabilities can be more effectively discovered and attain a job unique to their special talents. And through this effort, our goal is to replicate such models to use them as a tool to improve disability employment. And finally, a third key way to ACL seeks to affect change is partnering with our federal agencies. A big part of ACL's role inside the federal government is to advocate, partner, and be resilient advocate to continually surface the issues at the table that matter to the communities we serve. In our government citizen services surrounding employment, we are often challenged in that there are a lot of different funding streams to support people with disabilities. And we recognize it's important we coordinate our federal resources to ensure no one falls through the cracks. And to achieve that goal, ACL recently released 2 documents with partners from the federal government that described a variety of resources to expand employment opportunities for people with disabilities. And one such resource was titled Resource Leveraging and Service Coordination to Increase Competitive Integrated Employment for People with Disabilities. And basically, this resource provides a guidance on how states and local governments can blend, grade, and sequence funding to proactively maximize resources from a variety of different federal programs to support transition-age youth and their families. In closing, I would like to share that as hard as COVID-19 had been to our communities, it had really helped us redefine the work setting of what is possible for the future. I sincerely believe we can advocate this new normal of virtual workforce to increase labor force participation of the disability population. Thank you again for letting ACL share opening remarks as we launch National Disability Employment Awareness Month in the US. And we look forward to learning from you, our global partners, on how you are innovatively serving people with disabilities. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, David, for those very important and relevant remarks. And that actually segues really nicely. So I would love to now welcome Alyssa Klein from the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development, or DEED. and Lindsay Horowitz from the Minnesota Department of Education, without whom we probably would have never gotten this project of national significance because they are essential project partners. So over this side. Yeah.
Thank you, Renata. Okay, well, good morning. My name is Lindsay Horowitz, and I am the statewide lead for transition services at the Minnesota Department of Education.
And I'm Alyssa Klein, and I'm the statewide lead for transition services at the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development with the Vocational Rehabilitation Program, otherwise known as VR. We are honored to be here today to welcome all of you to today's Global Transition Forum. The two of us have been in the field of serving youth transitioning from school to adulthood for many years.
I've worked in education for over 15 years, and I began as a special education transition teacher, a former principal, as well as a special ed director of special services. And then my previous work and positions have led me to my current position here at MDE.
And I've been with our VR program for over 25 years, starting out serving youth in several suburban high schools here in Minnesota, and then coming into my current statewide position in 2006. 3 years ago, our paths came together when Lindsay's career journey led her to her current position. We are both very passionate about seeing all youth with disabilities, including youth with intellectual and developmental disabilities, have the resources and supports they need to transition from high school to post-secondary education, competitive integrated employment, and independent living.
In Minnesota, we have almost 500 independently operated school districts and charter schools. When we started our work together, we both recognized there was inconsistency in how transition services were delivered across schools and other programs like VR. And there wasn't enough state level guidance for how we should all work together in partnership to ensure that students all get what they need and be prepared for what comes next after high school. That's when we began working on a statewide transition framework that defines what high quality transition services should look like for all professionals that serve youth with disabilities. After several years of hard work, we are proud to announce that 2 weeks ago, our framework went live within a new Youth in Transition Toolkit that lives on a shared website we have in Minnesota called the Disability Hub Minnesota. We will be sure that everyone gets a link to that website either in the chat or through email after today.
Our transition framework has 3 key elements. The first, learning expectation. The second, guiding principles, and the third is shared practices. Learning expectations define the curricula for consistent, high-quality transition programming focused on topics that support the transition to adult life. The topics are organized into 4 domains: My Best Life, Independent Living, Employment, and Post-Secondary Education and Training. Each topic has 4 learning stages. The first is awareness, helping youth get familiar with the topic. The second is exploration, which is about assisting young people to discover their strengths, interests, preferences, and needs related to the topic. The third learning stage is preparation, when youth can practice skills and make decisions related to that topic. And finally, the fourth learning stage is implementation, which is when the youth is using topic-related skills in daily life. And that's what we want to help them achieve as much as possible.
The second element of the framework, guiding principles, are based on person-centered practices, which include start transition planning early, engage families as partners, foster self-determination, focus on strengths, hold high expectations, embed inclusive practices, develop strong partnerships, and use data-driven approaches to drive outcomes.
The final element of the framework, shared practices, ensure a consistent experience for youth and families while optimizing the role of everyone on the transition planning team. Shared practices include the use of person-centered practices and tools, My Vault, which is a feature of the Disability Hub MN website that allows you to save all of their important information. And then the third is a consistent youth planning process that all schools, VR programs, and others use together when we serve youth.
This year, we will be testing our framework with 30 community teams, which include school, VR, and county partners. They will learn about everything we have in our toolkit and using those tools with students to give us feedback on what works and what is missing. From there, we will be promoting this new way of doing business together statewide for the 2023-24 school year.
We are also working with the University of Minnesota Global Resource Center for Inclusive Education on this effort, which will include their expertise in evaluating the effectiveness of the framework. For that reason, we know that you'll have opportunities to hear about the outcomes of our work for years to come.
Again, thank you for inviting us to be a part of your global forum today. We are excited to be learning from all of you and the work you are doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay and Alyssa. Speaker.
So one of the unique aspects of Impact Magazine, or newsletter as we call it, is that for each issue, we do a deep dive into a topic, and every article stems from that topic. And so we gather experts from the field, both from within ICI and outside of ICI, to come together as editors who then fan out and look for authors in the field who would be great to write about the latest in the field and tell their own personal stories and share what's working in different programs. And so that's really the process, but what really brings it to life is when authors really take this to heart and share both stories of the work they've done professionally, as well as the personal impacts that have really guided their lives. And so Stephanie Gottlieb is certainly a great example of that in our issue. Stephanie has worked in the disability sector for 25 years plus in various positions. She was CEO of Children and Young People with Disability Australia for 10 years in the mid 2000s. She also has experience with disability as a parent, and she is here today at a quite unusual time because of her time zone. So we really appreciate her being here live. So Stephanie, if you're with us still and awake, please begin.
I am. Can you all hear me okay? I presume so. I can't. Yes. Great. Yes, it's 1 a.m. here, so I'm tiring. But I thought it was better to speak with you in person if possible, because I think, recordings are good, but it's better in person. I just want to thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and start off with a shout out about the publication Impact and this particular edition. I read it cover to cover, of course, in preparation for today, but also because I'm really interested in transition, because it's been a pretty hard slog for us as a family in terms of ensuring that my son Adam has a rich post-school life. But it was excellent. I kind of devoured it, and I just learned so much. It validated my own experiences, made me think about things that we could do in the future as a family and as an advocate. And I just, I thank everyone that contributed and the editors. I think it's an exceptional publication. So my article was a little bit different, I suppose, in some ways, because I focused on some of the work that I did or led when I was CEO of CIDA, so Children and Young People with Disability Australia, which is the National Representative Persons Organisation. I was the inaugural CEO for that, and the organisation started in about 2008, and I was there for about 10, 11 years. And I suppose from the get-go, families and some young people with disability continuously raised issues around gaps and problems with post-school transition. I suppose more that there was none, you know, or that there certainly are programs, but for many families that contacted us, and it was mostly families that contacted us around it, I think they were just left to their own devices, and were finding it extremely difficult. So that led us to seek some funding, because I thought we really should look at it, because it was certainly a consistent issue, and we were successful in getting some private philanthropic funding, which allowed us to look at the direct experiences in more detail of young people with disability in post-school transition, and also to look at the system that existed and try and come up with some recommendations about what should happen. In a nutshell, what we found, we did a report, which is available online. I can send through a link. And in a nutshell, what we found were experiences were highly variable, but typically, the experiences reported of post-school transition were poor. And there was a real lack of clarity. The reasons for this was there was real lack of clarity around who is responsible for post-school transition. So in terms of which government, so whether it is the state government, we have 8 different state governments here, or whether it was the federal government. And which portfolio, it didn't seem to fit neatly into a portfolio. So no one had responsibility for it. So it's not clearly within the education portfolio or the disability portfolio or the employment portfolio. It just kind of, it was a bit ad hoc. Routinely reported that there was a lack of information for students and families. There weren't that many options. There was some states were better than others in terms of formal programs and supports that were available. But there was really huge gaps. And the project was undertaken prior to the introduction of our National Disability Insurance Scheme, which I'm sure many of you would have heard of, which is a person-centered, how do I explain it very briefly, a person-centered based services and supports system that we have in Australia that provides very rich funding, or can provide very rich funding for people that are on the scheme. That being said, though, I mean, this is my view, but I don't think post-school transition has actually improved much today for young people with disability, even with the establishment of the NDIS. It's still, experiences are highly variable, it's often problematic. And in my view, I still think that the supports and the programs that exist are fairly one-dimensional, where they seem to look at the obtaining of employment as the ultimate goal, which is, undeniably important. But I see post-school transition as being around a whole lot more than that. And I really love Jan Siska's articulation of it as active citizenship. I thought that was wonderful in the article and the work that was reported in this publication. So I then, in my article, I've shared my own experience of post-school transition, or not my experience, my son's experience. My son, Adam, is 22 years old. I'm not sure how I'm going for time, so please interrupt me when I'm getting near the end of my time. So Adam's 22, he's very fit, he's very active, he's inquisitive, he's full of joy for life, particularly at the moment. He's pretty happy with himself. We're a family, there's 4 kids in my family, and he loves his family, he loves his volunteer work, he loves travel, he loves music. He's an active young man who's very interested in and active in the community, and relationships are really of critical importance to him. Now, Adam's a man who, as a kid, it was assumed and imposed on us that he should have a segregated life from when he was a very young child. He's a man of few words. He has a very high communication support needs, and he'd be someone, if you're into labels, which I'm not, I mean, I can share with you labels that have been subscribed to him, but I won't. That certainly seen, you know, as significantly disabled and having significant needs. So for us, post-school transition, it seems to me like it was a really long process, which I think is good. I think it needs to be. And I think it actually started early in his life when we pretty soon realised that we need to ensure that there was an expectation and experience of inclusion for Adam in his life. And he started off in special school, but we very soon realised that was not the most the best thing for him or anyone, and did the vigilant advocacy that many families do to ensure that he had an inclusive education and went to school with his siblings in both his primary and high school. So I think that having an inclusive life has really afforded Adam rich opportunities to develop familiarity, connections and relationship in his community, not shipped off somewhere else to go to school, but, you know, being in his local community, getting to know kids in the community, getting connections, and I've articulated this in my article. And I think he very much has developed a sense of trust and had experiences and he recognises that he's valued and he belongs to his community. And I think that that's really set the scene for his post-school transition. It was very clear to me from my own experiences that we were going to have to take the lead as his family in post-school transition and planning what his life is going to be like after school, in that we couldn't rely on services and supports, and the schools and education system didn't have very much knowledge. And I was blatantly aware through my work and through my own pursuing information that there wasn't much available in terms of services and supports that would tailor to Adam's interests, needs, community, or had an expectation of inclusion. I wanted to say that a pivotal kind of time, I think that was really important, was when Adam was in year 10. So he would have been about 15. So his third last year of formal schooling, when we were asked to meet with the principal and the senior leadership team. And I presumed we were going to get the talk that, you know, had we ever thought of a special school and, you know, he needed to have a special life and segregated life. It was far from that. I couldn't have been more wrong. It was about, the meeting was called because the school really wanted to start working with us around how we could structure and work together to ensure that Adam's senior schooling prepared him as much as possible for life after school, which was incredibly important.
So Stephanie, we'll have to wrap up.
Okay. I'll just say a few things. So basically, you know, we pieced together very individual post-school life, which is based on Adam's interests. And I would say that in terms of what I think was really important, the critical components was it's always person-centered and led, vigilant advocacy by his family and a really strong role of his family, that expectation of inclusion. The funding, I think, is really important because Adam's someone who needs individual support. So having generous funding to the NDIS has been very important. I think being in the unique position of having my own personal knowledge and skills has been helpful. And the drivers for Adam are the relationships that he has with people and the barriers, just very in 20 seconds. I have to say COVID, because Adam finished school and then in June we were in lockdown. We live in Melbourne, in Australia, and we've had, I think, the longest kind of lockdown out of anyone in the world. The world just didn't make sense to anyone, but let alone someone with his disability and and support needs for comprehension. It was really a terrible time. The policy context where no one's really taking responsibility, the low expectations of people, ableist views, which I think are particularly extreme for people with high communication support needs and intellectual disability. And I think finding age appropriate work opportunities and volunteer opportunities and other activities for a young person. There's limited unless you're in traditional employment. So I'll leave it there. Sorry, I've whizzed through it, and I hope that gave you a glimpse. But please read the article and feel free to contact me via email. And I'm certainly going to be making contact with people because I think we speak the same language. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Stephanie. So we are going to move from Australia to the Kingdom of Bhutan, and it is a great pleasure for me to introduce Chencho Om, who is a senior teacher in the Wangso Institute for the Deaf in Paro, Bhutan. And we had the great pleasure to meet Chencho both in Bhutan and in Minnesota as part of a project we had on transition to employment with Matt Cholka, Chris Johnstone, and Brian a couple of years ago. So welcome, Chencho.
Hi, Renita. Thank you so much. I hope my voice is audible to you all.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Kuzuzampo to everybody, which means hi to greetings from Bhutan. So, thank you so much for including me as a part of your program. I feel very privileged to be making presentation here. So, Renita, is it possible for me to share my screen? Hello?
So Chencho, if you can just use your, do you have photos on your screen?
I have some few like slides and then photos as well on my screen. I have like made a sort of a presentation.
That's okay. Yeah, we can do that.
Thank you.
Nick is going to enable screen sharing for you.
No, thank you. I hope my screen is visible to you all.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so before I do my presentation, I would like to just briefly make a short summary. So first, I would like to present about brief data about people with disabilities in Bhutan. And then secondly, I would like to go about what are the problems that we face in Bhutan for smooth transition of people with disabilities. And thirdly, I would like to present short presentation about my school, which is the only school for the people with deafness in Bhutan. So first, to make a short data about the people with disabilities in Bhutan. Okay, so before I go on with the data, I think that first steps in Bhutan, the name itself suggests like Bhutan, the concept of disability in Bhutan has evolved just few decades ago. So a long time ago, we didn't have like sort of people in Bhutan, we were not aware of what disabilities are there in our country, what type of disabilities, how to go about with people, how to help people with disabilities. So just like a few decades ago, the people with disabilities, or rather say students with disabilities in Bhutan were sort of neglected, or they were sort of not included in the society. So that's why I think the name itself suggests, the name itself is clearly mentioned, first steps in Bhutan. So to go on with my data, so that as I don't know, most of you might be aware about Bhutan, most of you might know about Bhutan. So general population in Bhutan, as per the Population, Housing and Census of Bhutan 2017, we have around 341,881 male and 339,839 female. So our total population is around nearly 700,000. So that is the population of Bhutan in general. And then out of that, if you go to the people with disabilities in Bhutan, as per the 2017 population, housing and census of Bhutan, we have around 12,512 people with disabilities living in rural area, and we have around 3,055 people with disabilities living in urban areas. So out of that, now if you go to, now if you go to people like disabilities, varieties of disabilities, people having different types of disabilities, we have around 1,929 people with disabilities having seeing difficulties, and around 1,360 people with hearing difficulties, 997 with walking difficulties, 1,806 with remembering difficulties, 867 with self-care difficulties, 791 with communication difficulties. So these are like sort of, what is the data having various kinds of disabilities in Bhutan. And then out of that, we have like inclusive schools. We have around 30 inclusive schools for children with disabilities in Bhutan. And most of the schools, they have been started just in a few years ago. We didn't have schools for children with disabilities before. Actually, in fact, our like school for children with disabilities, it was first in Bhutan, it was first time started in 1973. That time, it catered to only children with blindness. We didn't have like, before 1973, we didn't have school education facilities for children with other disabilities besides blindness. And then in 2002, we had first inclusive schools for children with disabilities in Thimphu, which is in the capital, followed by school for children with hearing for deafness, which was started in 2003 which is my school. So, and then slowly we had now, as of now, we have 30 schools for children with disabilities in Bhutan. And out of which 545 are boys, 381 are girls, and we have in total about 926 children with disabilities who go to school in Bhutan. So now to come back for the transition service of people with disabilities in Bhutan. I think for successful transition of children with disabilities, I think I feel that it is important to have a collaborative cooperation between teachers, students, related agencies, parents, community organizations. Without collaboration among these stakeholders, I feel that transition of people with disabilities will not be successful. That is why in Bhutan at present, like transition services for people with disabilities has not been that fruitful. We have not we are just at an initial stage. We have not yet started with that transition. We are still in the process. So now to mention like few drawbacks, why transition is not like fruitful or why it is not happening as expected. I have few slides to present here. So from the students' perspective, I think because of their disabilities, they have not been able to express their needs. And then like, since we didn't have education system for people with disabilities, they are not able to go to the school. They are not able to, learn what they require. And because of which they are not able to express their needs. They are not able to do what they want to do, which leads to low confidence and self-esteem. And because of that, children with disabilities, they are not aware of their rights, their laws. And then the other thing is like inaccessible transport services. In Bhutan at moment, we do not have like transport services which are accessible for all the people with disabilities. For example, our bus system. Of course, just this year, we have introduced a bus that is accessible for people with disabilities. So till last year, we didn't have any transportation system that is accessible for people with disabilities. And then another one is most schools do not have accessible features. most of our schools in Bhutan, they are not accessible for people with disabilities, because our government or our people, we never thought, like long time ago, we never thought of people, like students with disabilities, they were just sort of ignored. And then one thing is like our transition was not successful because our policy, rules and regulation demands that people with disabilities they have to compete people without disabilities, which is impossible for them. So from students' perspective, these are some of the drawbacks that has not been that limits our students for successful transition. And from teachers' perspectives, we do not have now forget about ineducate. Most of our teachers teaching in inclusive schools, we are not trained to be taught. We are not trained to teach children with disabilities. Most of the teachers, almost I think around 90% of us, we were trained to teach children without disabilities. So for that is something that impacts people with disabilities for smooth transition, because most of the teachers are not trained to teach children with disabilities. We are not aware of what their needs and what their rights are. And that has, because of that one, okay, I heard somebody speaking something. So because of that one, we are not able to address their needs, the needs of children with disabilities. And then like teaching learning equipments also, they are not disabled friendly. Like all our teaching learning resources are actually meant for students who are without disabilities. We do not have sort of accommodations, modifications, these sorts, these things were not there. Of course, now with the introduction of inclusive schools, slowly we are coming up with all these things. And then, as I mentioned before, most of the schools do not have accessible features. Like for blind students with blindness, most of the schools do not have braille. For children who have physical disabilities, there is no ramps. There is most of the students are not accessible. And for children with hard of hearing or for deafness, there is no interpreter. There is only one school for the students with deaf in Bhutan, and that is where I teach. So it's very difficult for students from other parts of the country to go to the school and learn in sign language, because we do not have those facilities in all the schools in Bhutan. And we still have few instances where few students mock at students with disabilities, which prevents the students with disabilities from coming to school. So these are some from teachers' perspective. And then if I go to parents.
So please, we need to wrap up. So in about 3 minutes.
Okay, sorry, I'll do twice in now. I don't have much. And then from parents' perspectives, parents are not sure. Parents are not aware of their children's capabilities. They always think that, okay, they are disabled, they cannot do anything. And then the parents choose to keep them they choose not to send their children from school because they are worried that their children might get bullied. Or sometimes the school are too far from their houses. And that's why the parents do not want to send their children to school. And from related agencies or from the government's point of view, the existing policies, plans, social structures, and attitudes, they impose greater limitations for children with disabilities from going to school or for smooth transition. The government agencies or related corporate agencies, they are not sure about the capabilities of people with disabilities. They are hesitant to employ due to additional environment and other accommodations that have to be made. So compete on merit with students with disabilities. They will have to compete with students without disabilities, which is beyond students their capacity, and not sure how person with disabilities who are more vulnerable to violence and abuse seek justice and protections. So these are some of the things that protects or that limits our children for smooth transition of the students. And now, okay, so as I mentioned, so slowly Bhutan is coming up with inclusive society, with support for people with disabilities. Now, to mention few, now there is more awareness about people with disabilities. We have like come up with few organizations who work for people with disabilities. So these organizations help to spread awareness, information about people with disabilities. And recently, Bhutan Post introduced, as I mentioned earlier, just recently, Bhutan Post introduced new public bus with disability-friendly features. Ministry of Labor and Human Resources, they started providing vocational training to few people with disabilities. The banks, they have made an effort to make services disabled friendly. And then we have like other services for children like before, which were not there before. The athletic grounds all have accessible toilets, including ramps, and the justice sector is working on improving access to justice. So, and then we have also like national policies for people with disabilities, which was just started in 2019. So these are some of the success stories which are slowly coming up for smooth transition. And now if I come to my school,
So we really need to wrap up. So if you can just end with this slide.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, so my school, it was just started in 2003. And as I mentioned earlier, this is the only school for the children with deafness in our school. And then like we have classes from preparatory to class 12 academic and classes 11 to 12 vocational classes like tailoring, wood carving, carpentry, Buddhist painting. And these are some of the data. And then like the only civil service opportunity that is like being provided to people with deafness is like our institute, which has them as a deaf instructor, as a teaching assistant. So this deaf instructor, they work in our school, they help in like developing documentation and then research of Buddhist Sign Language. And they also like help, they also assist teacher in teaching sign language too. So as of now, I think in the civil service, these are the only opportunities that is available to our students with people with disabilities. So now I have a few slides where these are some of the evidences where our students work in the vocational trades. Like these are students who work for carpentry. And then these are students who work for wood carving. And then we also have like for tailoring. So these are some of the, activities we have in our school, which will help our students for smooth transition. If not employed by the government, they can work on their own. They can do small business on this for themselves, and then they can earn their living. So I hope I did my presentation up to your expectations. I don't know how far I made my Renita. That's the end of my presentation.
All right. Oh, thank you very much, Chen Cho. Greetings to Bhutan, and please stop sharing your slides. So Jan is now going to introduce the next two speakers.
The next speaker is Martin Kawa from Kenya. Martin is an disability expert in Kenya, working in the Ministry of Education. And he was also a lecturer at the Kenyan Institute for Inclusive Education. Currently, Martin is our PhD student at the Charles University in Prague, the Czech Republic. Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Prof. I hope everybody can hear me. If you can confirm, please.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. So I am going to make a presentation which is fairly chronological. That was also the structure of the article that I had presented for publication. And that was written together with Samuel Juma, who is a statistician at the Kenya Institute of Special Education in Nairobi, where I used to work before I moved to the Ministry of Education. So I would like to start by maybe just making a simple definition of what in Kenya defines technical and vocational training. In Kenya, basically define these differences depending on the level. That vocational training for us would usually be that which is before secondary school and up to secondary school. That would be vocational mostly, actually before secondary school, pre-secondary. And post-secondary training usually would qualify as technical training. So technical training is seen as being more advanced than vocational training. So moving on to the historical dimensions that I had presented in the paper, just to show where we're coming from. The history of this training in the country is, goes back to 1924, where we had the first institution that was the Native Industrial Training Depot. And this was intended to train, local people to provide services to the colonial administration that was in welding, masonry, and such. In 1939 was the establishment of the Egerton College, which today is Egerton University. And this was intended to train extension officers to serve the large-scale farmers that had come from Europe to do farming in the country. And this was an advancement, of course, in technical training. So there was not much development at the time, until after 1963, when the country got independence. And after that time, of course, there was now demand for labor. Remember that before independence, there was pretty much not much activity and not much occupation or leeway to operate for the locals, because, for example, the Kenyan population wasn't allowed to, for instance, plant certain cash crops, and therefore there wouldn't be need for the extension officers. They weren't allowed to take up some positions in the offices, or maybe these were some of the issues that led to the slow development. So after independence, there was now increased demand for labor. And therefore there was an establishment of a national technical secondary schools in order to train more people that would be qualified, as to serve as technicians and also in the various areas. That continued, and later different government institutions saw the gap, and they started to establish their own institutions that would train their own people. And this included, the Ministry of Tourism, which established Utalii College, Kenya Medical Training Colleges that were, established by the Ministry of Health to train their own people. The Kenya Power and Lighting Company also established a training school for their own. Fast forward to the 1980s was, establishment of now these technical institutions, institutes of technology, actually they were called at the time, across the 8 provinces in the country. And this was now a deliberate attempt by government to sort of create more opportunity for training in the area of, vocational and technical training. This would be sort of the equivalent of community colleges in the US, roughly, but without the advantage of the possible, advancement of their training, probably to degree level, or, moving from certificate to PhD, etc. That wasn't a possibility at the time, and it hasn't been a possibility until recently. So in 1984, there was a change of the curriculum. So we came to the 844 curriculum, which was also focused on technical training. This continued all the way through the 80s and the 90s. However, in the 1980s, the late 1980s, there was introduction of the structural adjustment programs by the International Monetary Fund, as well as the World Bank. And that meant that the government couldn't employ. There was a freeze on employment as a condition for accessing, loans from these 2 institutions. And therefore, the aforementioned institutions that were established by government ministries lacked people to train because they had no new employees. And there, as a result, we had now these institutions opening their doors to people that were not employed to them. And this was a new opportunity for the rest of the population to access technical training. In 1990, there was a lot of development now in this area, but then it was unregulated. Now, this regulation began to come in around 2008. And even before I proceed to the 2000s, there was a loophole that came out of this unregulated development, that established organizations like banks and hotels, couldn't find high quality trainees. Why? Because the training was of poor quality, because there were very many mushrooming institutions without much regulation from government. And therefore, many banks, or a couple of the main banks and hotels and such institutions, established their own training institutions, which exist to this day. So around 2008 was establishment of the launching of the Vision 2030, which had the social pillar, which was heavily reliant, or which is heavily reliant on education. And in this pillar, the financing and equipping of technical and vocational education and training is really emphasized. Now, in 2011, to support this development, was 2 task forces that were formed. The reports of these 2 task forces culminated in the writing of the sessional paper number 14 of 2012, and this was a policy framework for reforming education and training in Kenya. And this was the beginning of major reforms in the area. Now, this also ended up with the TVET Act, the Technical and Vocational Education and Training Act of 2013, which was enacted by Parliament. Now, among the things that this act was expected to do was, provide for the establishment of a technical and vocational education and training system, provide for the governance and the management of institutions offering technical and vocational education and training, provide for coordinated assessment, examination and certification, institute a mechanism for promoting access and equity in training, and assure standards, quality and relevance, for this area. Now, what is the status currently after this development? Now, currently, as a result of the act, there's a fully pledged government state department for this technical and vocational education and training. We have a new curriculum which supports this as well. By the way, we have a new curriculum. We call it the competency-based curriculum. There are still discussions going around this. The initial class, the first class, is now in grade 6. Now, this curriculum provides for 3 pathways of development, and one of those pathways is actually technical training. There is no more financing for the section, and we now have, and this has been for some time, maybe I should have mentioned it previously, the National Youth Service, which provides free paramilitary training for persons who have undergone secondary education, and thereafter they provide technical training, so they would produce drivers and mechanics and plumbers and such people. This has been a major booster for the training in the country. Now, you might notice that up to this point, I haven't mentioned much about persons with disabilities, and it's good to mention that the National Youth Service is currently also engaging more persons or trainees with disabilities within its training program. Now, we have the training programs established in the country, and the institutions classified as follows. We have, of course, the national polytechnics, then the technical training institutions, and the vocational training centers. In total, we have 1,300 training institutions, both public and private, that is, across the country. This was by 2018, a survey that was done, and out of which 4 are specially reserved for persons with disabilities. Currently, the institutions are encouraged to be inclusive, all of them, not just some of them. And most learners with the disabilities now are ending up accessing this kind of education. It's also good to mention that most learners and trainees that have declared disabilities in Kenya attend special learning institutions, special schools. I was a teacher in one of those schools, the Kitui School for the Deaf. And it's good to mention that in those schools, we have vocational centers where children or learners would complete their primary education and they would join the vocational training centers and acquire skills, especially in dressmaking and carpentry. That was very common. And this was a major booster and a source of training for the children and trainees with disabilities in the country, because there was a loophole. There wasn't much transition opportunities for them. Now, currently, we still have this going on. Examination and training is and certification is done by NITA, which is the National Industrial Training Authority, and also the Kenya National Examination Council. The curriculum development is also and certification, assessment and certification is also done by an organized institution that is called the Curriculum Development, Assessment and Certification Council. So this has approved currently 358 courses, which we hope will still benefit the persons with disabilities in the country. We now have a sector policy for learners and trainees with disabilities under the Ministry of Education. This was established in 2018, complete with the implementation guidelines. And this is providing guidance in vocational training as well. And I must mention that the Constitution of Kenya is very pro-inclusion, and it supports training for persons with disabilities, complete with setting up quotas for their employment and making it mandatory, for example, to have interpreters in forums that are public and in provision of information. This has ensured that information gets to persons with disabilities, and therefore, of course, knowledge is power. They are able to apply for these opportunities that come up and get information and access the training. Every government organization is expected to have a disability desk. Specifically, the Ministry of Education in Kenya now has a directorate of special needs education, which has gone a long way to support and to advocate for persons and trainees with disabilities. We have also the Ministry of Labor, which contributes very much in provision of awareness and opportunities and lobbying as well for persons with disabilities. Finally, I would like to mention that in Kenya, the civil society, non-government organizations have also established programs that are, sometimes piloting and also implementing and supporting the employment and training of persons with disabilities in the country. And I would like to stop there. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. So we are moving from Kenya, I believe, to Ethiopia, right?
Yeah. So thanks to these technologies, we are able to move to Africa again, to sub-Saharan country, which is Ethiopia. Is, by the way, my second home country. And it's my pleasure to introduce my good colleague and friend, Jirga Sheva-Bekele from the Addis Ababa University. Jirga Sheva is currently a director for the Center for Support for Students with Disabilities at the university. Jirga has been very influential in Ethiopia, promoting inclusive education across the country, and I had the privilege to work with Jirga Sheva for a couple of years with support of the Finnish government. So Jirga Sheva, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Greetings to all from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. I'm privileged to be part of this important symposium. I would like to talk about positive impacts carried out in Addis Ababa for children with intellectual challenge. So I want to make very specific to that organization because there are so many positive things. And if I get time, I will talk about national issues in this regard. Center for Children with Mental Challenge is supported by Ethiopian Evangelical Church and established about 28 years ago. It was not easy at that time for this organization to carry out education and social service for children with intellectual limitation because the awareness and the attitude issues are somewhat different as compared to the current situation of the community. But at that time, they have to knock door to door to talk and what intellectual limitation is and how we can support them, how they can be productive and self-sufficient. So there was a lot of tough tasks that the organization has to pass, but finally they started to provide the necessary supports to the community. And this service was door-to-door identification of children with intellectual limitation and providing skills for parents on how to take care of children with intellectual limitation at the early age. And then when their age is a little bit increased, they invite them to the Center for Many Skill Provisions. And among all, the organization usually highlights that many of these kids are from low socioeconomic class and often found to have malnourishment, and nutrition provision was the primary priority in the organization, so that kids may start to strengthen themselves mentally, physically, and socially after getting the nutritional supply. Then the center provides basic education skills like basic literacy skills, numbers and letters. These are the target of the education, depending on the readiness and interest of the child and how the child is changed in the provision of the skill. And then when their age increased, the center started to provide life skill training, which is very important, the social skill, the pre-vocational trainings, and self-feeding, self-caring. All these are the intensive provisions that the organization is providing. After finishing this pre-vocational skill period for many components and maybe 1 or 2 years or more, again, the organization moved to vocational skill session, where income generating can be possible for the individuals, where they can be productive and use their own creativity and interest. That was the important step for the center to identify each and every kid's interest and the potential and the capacity and how to help themselves in their livelihood. Which means the transitional aspect was very important for the organization. They work a lot on transitional support for children with intellectual challenge. So there are 2 things that the organization is providing: income generating possibilities or employment possibilities. So if there are kids who are interested to get employment in certain easy responsibility level, in a sense, responsibilities that can be handled by the individuals, they started to negotiate with the employers, and there is follow-up, and there is a skill provision on how to work with others and how to use their salary for their life. This is not an easy task. It may take some years to make them strong and continue in their employment. The second part is income generating activity. Income generating activity also has some components. Credit stream is also there, and identifying the basic skills that they wanted to carry out is the other. Empowering them to move on based on what they want to do is the other. So what I observed during my visit to the organization was it is really impressive. Kids grown up like age 15, 16, children with intellectual limitation found to be very disciplined, productive, in line with the expectation of the organization. And they started to generate income and selling some good products, as you can see from the magazine of this program, Symposium. There are many things that they deliver, holy bread for churches, and again, agricultural issues are also one of their income generating stream. Cattle, taking care of cattle and selling, reselling, and taking care of the profits they are getting. These are really the good models, even to the Ethiopian education provisions, how they are productive if they get the opportunity to do, So this organization is really a good model for our country. So I observed there are shop sellers. They have their own shop, and they are doing the business part. Of course, the parents must be there or adult siblings working together, but they are busy making their own business, and it's unbelievable to see how they are happily working this kind of things. So in general, the center brought awareness raising in the city, the larger city, Addis Ababa. Nowadays, it is not as such a discriminatory agenda talking about children with intellectual disability. You can see children with intellectual disability in recreation areas, in any space that many other children are spending. They are also there. So now awareness is impacted very well in the society, in the community as well. And they can also demonstrate their output products via media such as television. So it is really interesting. But really, does this kind of interesting output of the organization can be seen as a good at national level? We live to do much at national level. There is the resource center approach nowadays the country is doing. One school capacitated has to work and capacitate 3 or 4 schools. So this resource school has to accept the children, identify children, provide the necessary skill for children, and then those good models has to be taken by other close by schools. So this approach started to increase the number of children with intellectual challenge to come to school, but not directly to special regular class, rather special schools or special units. And there is a limitation in terms of skills to adapt the curriculum to the level, to the needs, and goals, setting goals for each child and moving the child towards that goal. These are some of the limitations at national level that we have to do in the future. And transition is not an agenda at government or public school so far. This is a non-governmental organization which is which is working in a very good in a model way. So the government has to take this kind of very interesting models to the larger public school setting where many children with intellectual challenges are available. So curriculum adaptation, working on transition at public school has to be an assignment for us so that we can look into the destiny of children with intellectual disability and help them to be self-sufficient, help them to be valued and look into that they are capable to do something like anybody else. So I'm not sure where.
All right, well, thank you very much. That was perfect timing. Greetings to Ethiopia. And unfortunately, our next speaker from Finland, Jyrki, had to apologize. He had a family emergency, so he will not be presenting, but please read his article. He's the president of Inclusion Europe. So with that, we are going to move to the Czech Republic.
In the special issue, we also introduce our joint project, which is actually there are 2 projects. One is conducted in the Czech Republic with our research team, and this project is focused on transition. We have been working in collaboration with Dr. Renata Tichá and our colleagues from the ICI for simple reason, because they also have been working hard on another project which is focused on transition on young people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Now, in this part, we are going to introduce the Czech part of our collaboration. It will be introduced by my colleague, Tereza Havránková from the West Bohemian University in the Czech Republic, followed by Renata's introduction to the project carried out in Minnesota. So Tereza, please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you today. Thank you for introducing our project to everyone. Well, our project, Researching Transition of Young People with Intellectual Disability, tries to bridge the gap in the knowledge to lived experience of young women and men with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And as they transition from school to adult life. We also try to explore how young people with disabilities deal with not only the transition from school, but being part of a community. What do they struggle with? How do they feel? What they need help with? And who do they talk to if they search for help? We also try to look at their independence and development of social networks, because we highly believe that these parts are quite largely unexplored in the Czech Republic and also across Europe. Our study brings together primarily qualitative methodologies from education, social science, the arts with innovative techniques for collecting the experience of young people. We collect data from different sources. We base our focus group on meetings with parents of students with intellectual disabilities. Also, we have focus groups with young people with and without disabilities who are due to leave school, secondary level, and who are at the end of the current school year. We also will hold focus group with young people with and without IDD who have left school in the past 3 years. One with young people with disabilities and one with young people without disabilities. So there will be 2 different focus groups. We will also hold focus groups with teachers working with young people with IDD and in their last 2 years or 3 years of education. We will also organize one focus group with parents of young people and one focus group with staff that support young people with IDD. What is special and unique about our project is that we will also organize different drama sessions with students with IDD, and we will try to traject or explore their transition journey. We will also implement methodologies such as facilitated drama and film workshops, regular video diaries, and interviews with the young person and key people in their life will be conducted. Also, another uniqueness in our project is that one member of our research team is Michal Bednář, who is a person with IDD, and he's a great help and assist to our team. He helps us discover and explore his world, and he also helps us to explore what is difficult for him when he moved from school to work. And he tries to talk to us about his dreams, and also he tries to connect us with his future plans and also with his friends. That's maybe about our project. If there's anything, Jan, you would like to add, or Šárka Káňová, who's also here, present at the debate, you can definitely add to what I have said about our project.
All right, děkujeme, Tereza. Thank you, Tereza. So what's really exciting about this slide, but generally the idea behind this slide is really the parallel nature of these projects. So we, as Lindsay and Alyssa, talked about their work. They are our official partner on the project funded by Administration of Community Living, focused specifically on highlighting transition issues in Minnesota. However, as David Jones pointed out, there are 7 projects in the US funded in this cycle. So we also meet with the 6 partners, including, for example, in Arizona, Massachusetts, and in other states. Now, this project was funded in 2021. Its focus is really on mapping the landscape of transition in Minnesota in transition programs, but also, as you know, in Minnesota, not every district has a transition program. So the transition happens in high schools. And so we also have to look at some programs that are not specifically designed for students from the ages of 18 to 21. The other thing I want to point out, especially for the international audiences, is that the United States is quite unique in the way that it's one of the few states in the world that has specific legislation connected to funding to transition. And that is of course not the case, as we heard from many of the speakers around the world. So then when Jan came to ICI as a Fulbright scholar from Charles University, he subsequently, with his colleagues, Teresa and Čárka, who are also online, received a project from the Czech government that has a similar mission to ours. And so we have been working together with Brian, also with Matt, with James here who are in the room, sort of comparing notes as we go along. What are some of the similarities and differences in Minnesota and in the Czech Republic? So, as Alyssa and Lindsay also pointed out, we are partnering with them to do an evaluation and implementation of the transition framework on which they've been working very, very hard. And that's also very unique to the project in Minnesota, is that we have to, and we want to, work with the state agencies because they've been doing a lot of work many, many years before this grant got funded. And so it's really excited for the Minnesota part of the project to be able to really see this framework implemented and go along as our project goes along for the next 4 years. So I think that's all I would say. I don't know if Brian, you want to add anything, or Jan for the Czech side? Okay. All right. So we are gonna stay in the Czech lands. So next speaker is Dr. Jan Šiška, again, a Fulbright scholar from the Czech Republic at ICI. Talking about his contribution to impact meaning of life.
In my contribution to the special issue, I was trying to challenge transition, and in my presentation now, I will sum up what I understand as a mission of transition, and how, and several of my suggestions, how the transition might be redefined, and maybe So my article has a title, "The Meaning of Life, Active Citizenship as a Critical Transition Goal." The current research and practice suggests that support provided for young individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities during their transition from education to adulthood is primarily associated with paid job as an ultimate goal. Overall, training programs, transition planning, career guidance, and other instruments are heavily grounded on the traditional markers of adulthood, such as securing work and financial independence. In addition, work around transitions has largely ignored the views of young people with disabilities other than on structural inequalities around employment, as the research suggests. What also research suggests that the life course of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities often contains periods when they are not at work or in schools, and this presents an opportunity to focus on participation in a community's political process, leisure activities, volunteering, and other pursuits of interest of each individual. Some authors calls this approach a complexity approach, which require examination of transition as a non-linear life event that is broader than employment. And I argue that transition to active citizenship might be more useful than focusing only on limited outcomes of transition, such as employment. Citizenship and active citizenship are frequently spelled out in international documents related to education. For example, the fourth goal of the UN Global Development Goals is about ensuring by 2030 that all learners will be acquired with the knowledge and skills needed to promote global citizenship. The question is, what is the knowledge and the skills which should be acquired? To answer this question, it appears to be helpful to examine active citizenship. In the most systems, social systems, there are three basic principles associated with active citizenship as perceived by individual. And those principles is security, autonomy, and influence. Now let me briefly focus on these three principles. Security is related to reducing most critical uncertainties of the need for individual risk-taking, preventing continual fears about the future, and enjoy social protection against major life risks such as illness, poverty, violence. Different countries have different arrangements for providing for protecting their citizens against risks. The last 2 decades have witnessed a shift in the security dimension across many countries. Governments are relying on citizens to take on more active responsibilities in ensuring their own well-being and protecting themselves against a range of risks. This security principle is widely present in the existing transitions planning, focusing on employment. The second principle of active citizenship is autonomy. This principle rejects dependence on others and promotes living independently, exercising freedom, and living the life one wishes to live. So several developments in policy have led to improvements in their circumstances for exercising autonomy, self-determination in everyday life. Most notably, the closure of large residential institutions resulted in the growth of community living made possible through care and support, accessible physical environments, transportation, and new technologies. However, being a part of society physically as well as conceptually is critical to being able to actively participate and to being seen by others as part of the society. Viewing autonomy from a transition perspective, it is important to focus not just on housing and support for daily life, but on developing the willingness and capacity of communities to support people with disabilities to achieve active participation, self-determination, and enjoyment. The third principle is influence. It is related to participating in public deliberation and decision-making processes to set the framework for one's own life and contribute to interdependence, which is necessary for common good. The transition to adulthood in the context of influence is partially critical for the youth with disabilities, as they experience more severe barriers becoming active citizens, including lack of access to information and stereotypes about capacity and skills of persons with disabilities. Research suggests that the activities needs to involve the people with disabilities themselves to work with conflicts, potential conflicts such as assessment or shortage of available resources, stereotypes and barriers in social and attitudinal environment. The transition planning is the realm of influence. It should be a process of tailoring activities to meet the needs and expectations of individuals rather than placing responsibility for achieving goals in the hands of individuals. I suggest that the innovation is much needed. Little attention is given to transition planning that would go beyond employment, independent living, and post-secondary education. Leisure, relationships, caring for others, volunteering, voting, and other political activities are all essential components of contributing to society. The prevailing dependence on congregate and narrowly understood transition programs for young people with intellectual and developmental disabilities indicate that innovation in framework and transition is necessary to enable more young people with disabilities to experience active participation in society. Given the extensive disadvantage experienced by young people with intellectual disabilities in all aspects of their lives, active citizenship based on security, autonomy, and influence creates a valuable framework for deconstructing the current models of transition, of support programs and strategies, and for broadening opportunities across the lifespan. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan, for challenging us, challenging us to think about transition other than our usual mantras. So we are going to move to Spain, where our dear colleague Cristina Cardona is going to talk about her contribution to the impact. Cristina is a professor at University of Alicante in Spain, and she has also been on several occasions a visiting scholar to ICI. So many of you have seen her in person. So welcome, Cristina.
Thank you very much, Renata. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank you for giving us, my colleagues from Spain and me who wrote this article, the opportunity to collaborate in this special issue of impact. I really enjoy reading all the articles, and I learned so much from you. Today, I'm going to highlight some of the information that we included in the article addressing challenges in Spain in the issue of transition. I would like to emphasize that there is a law, Public Law 13 in 1982, that marked after and before and after for people, children, young and adults with disabilities. This law is called the Integration of People with Disabilities in mainstream settings. Before this law, almost every children, young and adult with disability were enrolled in special schools or settings in the, if we are talking about jobs, or in special units in the regular school settings. So with this law, it was compulsory that everyone was included to the maximum extent possible in the regular settings, regular schools, regular places for jobs, etc. So in only 40 years from the publication of this law, we have realized a lot of progress. And there are other laws after that that help to introduce these changes in the regular educational system and in the place work. But this is the first, the most determined law to make change everything. So, for example, for people, the big challenge before this law was that young with disabilities, when they finish elementary school, they have very few possibilities to continue education in secondary school and in vocational training programs. So one of the cornerstone of this law is that after that, the system began to develop other alternatives, other post-secondary programs in order to make possible that everyone have a place in education or in the work market. So after secondary education, now we have basic vocational training programs for these young people. These programs are usually in secondary schools. We have also special basic vocational programs for those who need more help, more support in their education. And the Public Law 13 from 1982, what brought to us mainly was the transition to adult life programs, that after that point, we have very few opportunities for these people when they got adult. So in Spain, we have to recognize that we don't have a special education system sophisticated like in the US or other parts of the world. We are a young country in helping the education, the people with disabilities, but young in regards to the development, okay? Because from 1978, we have several initiatives to help people who were blind or who were hearing of loss of death. So we are grateful, very grateful to this law that become to open the eyes that we have to invest more in transition to adult training, vocational training for young people and adults with disabilities. And I have to say that we have made a lot of progress, but it remains many barriers. Some of them is the access to education and training that in practice, we have a lot of programs, but in reality, many people with disability continue receiving enrolled in sheltered or low-paid jobs. So another main barrier is that vocational preparation and training programs are often disconnected to current labor market demand, and also disconnected from their interests and their abilities. So another barrier is that unemployment rates are higher, are 2 to 3 times higher than for people without disabilities. For example, many people continue having low expectations and attitudes about people with disability, including parents, employers, and sometimes teachers. For example, accessibility is another barrier. We still have many problems in physical, cognitive, sensory barriers. For example, for people who are blind, or for people who have these intellectual disabilities that can get a job, that when they arrive to the place of work, they don't have the necessary conditions to develop this job accordingly with their capacities. So implementation of the existing legislation is slow, and we have to make more effort to enforce this legislation, because the ideas are very good. We agree on the principles and the articles and the content of the laws, but in practice, the things change. So we need to move in that direction. For example, another important barrier is that there are no precise curriculum guidelines for making IEP program, an individualized program for these people, and helping multicultural, multidisciplinary teams to help them to make the right decisions for these people. So what we need is to move establishing these curricular guidelines and making enforce these guidelines. We need also to focus more than we already have do in supported employment, because the law on 1982 opened the doors to supported employment. Now we are progressing on this and in the customized employment, but we need to put much more effort on this. We need also to activate leadership, the leadership of the multi-professionals teams, in order to have guidelines, but at the same time have freedom to choose what is the best opportunities for people with disabilities, and have these opportunities opened, because sometimes they decided some services that when they look for, they are not in place. So we need to make progress in this direction, and also emphasize quality, inclusive education for all. We need to align more than we already have done in the action plan of the European and Spanish strategy on disability, and align with this and with the principle of the Sustainable Development Goal number 4. So we believe that we can make progress, significant progress, if just we put more effort, but not only the professionals, the Ministry of Education, the employers, everyone who can help provide a very dignity life for these people with disability. And I thank you very much for your attention. And that's what only some notes that I would like to highlight from my article. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Christina. Greetings to Spain. I do want to say that we have not built in a break because we just didn't have any time for a break. So if you feel like you need to move, do things, please do so. And so now Janet is going to introduce the next 3 speakers. Thank you.
So moving from Europe to North America, our journey takes us to a program profile, which we do in every issue of Impact. In addition to the broader academic articles, we also select through our communications with the editors and the other authors, promising programs that are implementing some of the trends and the issues that are brought up in the overview articles. And it was such a joy to be on a Zoom call with Scott and Ross McCaddy for this issue. We did sort of the article as a facilitated conversation. And I believe that Scott can't join us today because he is actually on the job and working, but I wish you could have seen the really the repertoire between father and son, because it was really a joy to see how Ross and Scott work together to really build the life that Scott has. And they have such a fun way with each other. But Ross is Scott's father, and he has also been involved in the family support network in Canada that you'll hear a little more about from Inez following his remarks. Ross, if you want to get us started, and you can take us through a little bit about your experiences, both as a parent and in supporting the organization.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Yes, unfortunately, you were stuck listening to me as opposed to hearing from Scott, who is definitely at work today. I have the pleasure, of course, of talking about him. What parent doesn't like to talk about their kids? So Scott is a young man. He's 30 years old. He has Down syndrome, and he has, I think, been living a pretty good life. And we have been trying to do our best to, provide him with a really meaningful and fulfilling life. And it became apparent to us that to be able to really, make good on that objective, we needed to work towards competitive employment for him. Of course, we didn't know really what we were doing. So there was a lot of trial and error, which means a lot of failures along the way. But that meant a lot of learning opportunities as well. And some of those opportunities I've been able to share with FSNE, and you'll hear more from Inez following my talk on the great work that that group has done. But Scott, as I say, he went through a regular education program. Some of it was integrated, some of it was segregated. He went through in a transition program. He went through 6 different work placements. And then when he graduated, he was able to find a course offered at a community college that focused on culinary arts. And he was able to do that program. And out of that program, he then tried to launch into competitive employment, where he went through 5 different jobs until he landed on his current job, which I'm really proud to say he has held for 7 years. In the last 3 years, he has had absolutely no outside support whatsoever. So I believe it's a really good example of competitive employment. He was able to work right through the pandemic, which was really key because, of course, at the facility he's working at, so maybe I should describe his job a little bit first. He's responsible for the dish pit in a cafeteria that is embedded inside of a pharmaceutical office/factory facility. And so this cafeteria, he's got the responsibilities of not only the kitchen dishes and utensils and whatnot, but also all of the consumer dishes and utensils and whatnot. And so he manages an industrial dishwasher, 3 different sinks, and is of course responsible for making sure that all of the clean product is properly handled and brought to the correct locations. And he helps out with a number of other kitchen duties as well as required. He takes great pride in his work because one of the things that brings satisfaction to him is really understanding what he's supposed to do and then executing on it and being able to take note of the fact that he did it successfully. And in this job, he's been able to check all of the boxes. He really understands his work thanks to the supports he's had in the early stages. And he's very proud of the execution. So as I mentioned, you know, our objective as parents is to really make sure he had a fulfilling life. And I think employment is really the key enabler. I mean, I would certainly have to agree with previous presenters that mentioned that it's not the only way of being an active and complete citizen engaged in community life. But in reality, it is the #1 thing that society judges us by. It is also the #1 thing that individuals with developmental disabilities are able to see as important. Scott has 2 brothers. They go off to work. They make money. They have girlfriends and wives. They are, you know, moving out into their own homes. These are all things that Scott wants to do himself. And he is well on the road to being able to do that. So employment, besides being able to sort of give him some sense of normalcy compared to his brothers and other people he knows in the community, it provides him, of course, with money, which is an enabler on its own. It provides him lots of self-confidence, a lot of pride, as I'd already mentioned. It gives him purpose. It helps to create a schedule for him. He's got a reason to get up every morning because 5 days a week, he goes in and does his job for 5 hours a day. It gives him motivation to learn how to use the transit system independently so he can get to work and get home from work. We're very fortunate that Scott's also able to even ride his bike during good weather, which happens at least a couple of months of the year in Canada. He can ride his bike to work and home from work. Once again, providing that level of independence, he's in control of his own destiny, which is really, really important for people with developmental disabilities. And I think another really key element, it is out of all of his experiences over his lifetime in this first 30 years, it is the most significant integration setting that he's ever been in. He's dealing with real people, he's making real friendships, and he's doing it all on his own, which is really important. So I think it is the most impactful integration of anything that he's ever been able to do. So, you know, obviously there were a lot of building blocks to get us to this stage where he is able to be competitively employed. I think #1 on my list is expectations that particularly from parents, but it has to be from everybody who's involved in helping to raise an individual, which is of course the whole community. We need to have high expectations that this is a reasonable and expected outcome, that he will be contributing to society. Of course, you need a good education. I think communication is really, really key. It's difficult for Scott to communicate clearly. And so he continues to work on that, but that's been another factor. I believe fitness is another issue that most people don't talk about, but quite frankly, people with developmental disabilities are not typically going to be working in the knowledge sector of our society. They're going to be working in more manual labor type things. And so physical fitness is actually a key enabler to be able to allow them to do a job successfully and with pride. His experiences through sports, learning how to be a team player, has been another key element, I think, in learning how to work effectively within the small team. There's about half a dozen people he works with in his job. And so to be able to take instruction and help each other, that's all supported through his experiences through sport as well. And then, of course, the various supports he's had from family, and then some official employment supports, which we have tried many things in the past. Many of them have not worked. None of them have worked to our expectations in terms of it can be much better. And I think that's a key element that Inez is going to be able to touch on, as to what really the support model should look like to help individuals attain successful competitive employment. Anyways, I could go on and on forever, of course, about my son. We're very proud of him. And I'm certainly happy to take any questions if anybody should have one. If not, thank you for the opportunity to share what I believe is a success story. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ross. And now Inez de Escalon, would you like to go next, please?
Hi, thank you very much for having me on this opportunity. And Janet, this is a time to express my gratitude to the support that you gave us. So the article could be included in your very interesting newsletter. So Ross has paved my way to this, and I think he was humble on the way that they as a family have been instrumental on Scott's life. And that's what we have seen, that a lot of all this success of certain people was based on the family's strength and the family's knowledge. And that wasn't fair to families, because there's a lot of ways that they should be supported to become successful for their sons and daughters. So we created this group of families, the Employment Support Network for the Family Support Network for Employment, in families that think alike. And Ross is a very good example of what we all think about it. So we did some research. We sort of looked at best practices, and we heard about personal stories. And we decided to create a knowledge base for families to become critical thinkers and be able to ask for the right support that they needed by understanding their roles and their responsibilities. And expectations, as Ross mentioned, was high on us. Inclusion is a huge gainer for all the work that we do. Employment, we do believe that defines you as an adult, as Ross mentioned. And then we decided that as families, we always used to sort of complain about things that are not working. And we decided, okay, if we don't come with solutions, it won't work. So we decided in our consultation, we understood that a consultative selling model with third-party representation was the way to pave the road for employment for many of those with disability that are out of employment. In Canada, 25% of individuals with intellectual disability are working, while 50% of adults with other disabilities while 75% of adults who have no disability. So there's a huge gap between those who have an intellectual disability and those who have another disability, and never mind with the general population. We understood that employment has to do with abilities, and maybe, as Ross also mentioned, the job seekers that we are sort of talking about are those who have minimal level of skills to do their job, but they have a huge willingness to do that. They are motivated, reliable, and dependable. They want to work, they will show up to work, and they will do the work that they are asked to the best of their ability. But because of their disability, they don't have access to employers, and they don't have credibility about working because expectations are very low. And so the traditional job readiness models, and many of we have heard over presenting here, like supported employment, like training that goes forever, that doesn't work for these job seekers. So because we need to address, because it's not about addressing their individual barriers, it's about addressing the systemic issues. So what we have asked is that we want to build a system, as I said, in a consultative selling model. The consultative selling model focuses on the employment agencies. In Canada and in Ontario, which we are basing our research, there's a lot of employment agencies, but they don't fulfill the dreams and expectations of job seekers with intellectual disability who want employment. So we are focusing right now. We focus first on families. So we did an online course so families can understand the system, can have higher expectations, and can start, as I said, become critical thinkers. But with time, right now, we're working to create the structure and the knowledge on all those agencies, because we need, in our research, we found that job developers needed to have a different approach to finding jobs for these people. And the difference in approach is that many of the employment agencies focus on identifying the wishes and the discovery of the individuals who have a disability, but they seldom touch on the employers. So this new model asks job developers to reach to employers and to have a huge number of employers that will be willing to hire the job seekers that they are serving. So job developers must focus on acquiring a high market share of employers in a wide variety of industries and businesses. They need to understand the employers' needs. They need to get employers to trust them in getting candidates for the jobs they need, and they need that employer reviews their minimum hiring requirements to get the candidates hired when they are only motivated, dependent, reliable, and dependable, MRD. Essentially, the employer buys the third party first, and this is the job seeker, and the idea of the potential job seeker solution before they hire the suggested job seeker with an intellectual disability. So job seekers, for us, need to do 4 steps on building that relationship selling. They need to find and qualify prospects. So that means finding the right employers in a non-competitive hiring situation. They need to consult for needs. They need to get to know the employer first, ask them what they need, and learning about the jobs, the problems and issues they want to address. Then they can sell the solution, present the job seeker solution after confirming that the job seeker is MRD and willing to try. And then they need to follow up, because as Ross showed, some support is needed, but not all the time. It's just many of them end up working by themselves with very little support. So job seekers, some final thoughts is job seekers with disability must be viewed as individuals and not as a group. They usually will have to have more than one job. You sort of heard it in Scott's case. And when there's failures, we need to gain experience from those failures, or the agencies that support them need to. We need to recognize, and I'm sorry, I'm coming out of COVID, so my voice is not sounding that great, that the job seekers can work regardless of their disability. So expectations is very important. So there needs to be a huge engagement of employers before you can place job seekers. So job developers in our research have to have at least 50 employers that they could call upon to see if they have jobs available, what they are hiring about. Usually they are jobs that are hidden jobs. They are not advertised. They are not in a website. Very few people get jobs like that. So we won't expect people with intellectual disability get those jobs. So as I said, to sort of finish up, we are trying to show or to teach what the employment service models should look like to be able to apply this relationship selling model. We want to build the capacity of those service providers, and we want to implement demonstration projects. One of the issues that we are having is that, as I said, we are a family network, and policies that talk about disability, they touch very little around families, and policies that around families touch very little about families who have a family member with a disability. And that's the big hurdle. And the other thing that we are finding is that the voices of families is not very well consulted. And when it is consulted, or when we have something to say, it doesn't make a change on the systems that are being put in place to support families. And so we're trying to work those hurdles to be a moving force on changing employment services in Ontario. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Inez. And I think we have just a minute to ask a quick follow-up question. And I was really interested in this notion of this third-party representation model. And I just wondered, I mean, it sounds like one of the keys to making this work is getting a lot of employer buy-in, a lot of employers in that network. Any thoughts on how to do that successfully? You know, even here in a city the size of Minneapolis, I know some providers really struggle to get a signups of that many employers, you know, on the caseloads that we have. Have you found that anything really works in terms of getting much bigger numbers of employers on board with something like this? You unmute her, or is she?
Ines is.
She's unmuted.
Maybe I can step in for Inez because her video seems to be frozen. If she comes back, I will be quiet. I can't speak for her, but I can speak for my experience in industry doing consultative selling. And you have to spend a lot of time working with employers to understand their needs. And so the problem with the current models is that the time is all spent with the people you're trying to place, and it's not spent out in the community doing cold calls, establishing relationships of trust with these employers and understanding what their true needs are. And so it's a completely different way of looking at it, to spend a bunch of time knocking on doors that have never been knocked on before, picking up the phone and talking to people and creating the networks to get references from one employer to another, to get into associations of employments, to be able to develop that network. So it takes a huge effort. It's not easy, and it's not in a skill set that is normally associated with people that support people with developmental disabilities. So it takes a salesperson to get out and be able to do cold calling successfully. And I see Inez is back on, so I'll let her answer the question. But I believe you're muted, Inez.
Thank you, Ross. So what we have found, Jared, to your question, is that there is a way of job seekers being trained to do this, reaching to employers. Yeah. So getting the share market of employers is important. There's 4 steps, as we heard, about qualifying the prospect. And we do have agencies that are doing some training of job developers. So Evolution Inc. is one of them. Alan Anderson, who has been our mentor, has a company that does those type of training to job seekers. Sorry, to job developers. And I can share that resources with you, so you can share them with the audience.
That's great. Thank you so much for that additional detail. So from our Canadian neighbors now to the United States, and actually here in our own backyard and in the Minneapolis area, we have Liz Hannon, who is the mother of Michael Grace. Liz, do you want to take it away?
Hi. Can you hear me? Yeah. Yes, I'm Liz Hannon. And
I am Michael Grace.
so we're both here today and very happy to participate. Thank you for asking us. We are just going to give a little glimpse into what Michael's life has been like post-transition, since he finished his transition program and internship at Children's Minnesota. And we're going to do this in sort of an interview format. So I'm going to interview Michael. So Michael, what have you been doing since the article was published?
I curate from Project Search and Tourism Plus in June.
And Project Search was a year-long internship at Children's Hospital, right? And what did you do there?
Went to work the very day. I did 3 rotations.
Three rotations?
Nursing services, pick up trays, wash them, NICU bedside cars, stuck PPE on the unit, mask, gloves, gowns.
Yeah. And you really liked it there, right? Going to work every day and interacting with so many of the staff. What have you been doing since then?
Looking for a job. I meet with a job course on Zoom once or twice a week. I have had interviews.
So you had a number of interviews. Have you found any jobs?
Yes, I have a job at Young Dance. I'm a sitting teacher. I have taken classes there for 10 years.
So you're an assistant teacher at Young Dance. And what kind of dance is it?
Modern dance for all abilities.
Modern dance for all abilities. And it's so great to build on those skills and relationships that you've had over the years. It was really exciting to go. And once you had your first class, the job coach thought you didn't need any further support because you totally know what to do and how to support the other students, right? Do you have any other jobs?
Yes, I am a teaching practice at Cal Dipping Press for 1 year.
So that goes through December. And that has been a year-long apprenticeship where you've done a variety of different things, including helping to teach these writing classes to people with disabilities, developmental disabilities. And you've had other interviews and job offers. It's been a slow process, and it's been hard to find a good fit. And it's important to us that we not just take any old job that he's been offered. It's hard to find a good fit looking at existing job postings. That's what we've discovered. And now we're really focusing on places that Michael has a relationship with. He does have a lot of unstructured days, which is not ideal. He really likes a structured day and likes to be out and about and mixing it up with people, contributing to his work. So you want to get a job. What are your other goals?
I want to go to college. I'm not sure where yet.
You've always said you wanted to go to college, and we're still working on that. What are you interested in studying?
Fair acting, performing arts.
You have always loved to perform, that's for sure. And you did take an acting class last year at the community college in Minneapolis, downtown Minneapolis College, and really liked that. So with all your free time, what activities are you in?
Unified Special Olympics at Europe and furniture at Children's Hospital at St. Paul once a week.
Volunteering at Children's in St. Paul once a week, and we do that together, right? And what else?
Trouble with cousins, aunts, and uncles.
We are taking advantage of the time to do a little traveling, visiting family. And what else are you doing?
I am a fair crash and we perform.
Yeah, that's been a great program. It's one of the things that has happened after transition programming is that most of the activities are through a signing up, and then and mostly they are designed for people with disabilities. So it's a little more segregated than when you have been in school. What else do you like to do?
Play basketball and golf with my family and my friends.
You like to be active. Is there anything else you'd like to share?
I both very Jackson. I am learning to cook.
You are learning to cook. You're taking a cooking class, and you're very involved in the elections. You voted in every election you've been eligible for, and involved in social justice activities. So those are the main things we wanted to share, but I'm not sure what time it is, but if there's any questions anybody wants to ask, if there's still time, we're happy to answer them.
Does anyone have any questions?
I don't have any questions. I just wanted to say hi, Michael. Way to go. Super proud of you. It's Lindsay. Way to
Hi.
go.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you. Great to be here. It's such an honor. And yeah.
And it's so great to have you both here. I knew your family was doing some traveling, so I wasn't sure if Michael
Yes.
was able to join us, but I will share that he is quite a performer. And when we went to do the photo shoot at Children's Hospital, Michael gave Connie Burkhardt and I a tour of the hospital, showed us everything that he was doing on a day-to-day basis. did a few cartwheels outside the sign, and he made us feel very welcome, and it was a really fun assignment to go get to see him in action. And so Renata, I was just going to ask you, do you want to power through? Do you want to take a break? We have some time if we need to, or we could just.
Minutes. So, yeah, why don't we can be a little human here. Let's give a 5-minute break, but
Okay.
let's be back 5 minutes sharp, because we do want to stick to the schedule. So
Right.
5 minutes, back at 10:50 Central Time, US time.
Great, we'll
Okay.
see you then.
So, our next speaker is Roger Stancliffe, who will be, even though he's at ICI, he will be online today. And Roger, I want to mention that Lindsay, who is from the Minnesota Department of Education, also knows Gus. So she was commenting, and she probably will say something after you speak.
Right.
So go ahead, Roger.
Right. Well, just before I make my presentation, I'm very interested that a number of speakers have raised the issue of low expectations, and I certainly agree that that's a major barrier for many people with IDD. And just to contextualize this presentation by saying this is a story of high expectations and the good things that happen when you have high expectations. So for this story from Minnesota here in the United States, I had the pleasure of interviewing Gus Manderscheid and his mother, Kathy. Gus also has a very interesting story to tell about his 3 part-time jobs in hospitality, sports, and entertainment. But for this story, I wanted to focus on how Gus came to be living in his own apartment, because having your own home is a transition outcome that usually receives much less attention than employment outcomes. I'm making the presentation today because Gus and Kathy preferred to be interviewed rather than to write the story themselves. Gus's successful transition from his family home to his own home in his mid-20s shows what's possible when you aim high, you have the consistent support of family and a case manager and disability funding and support services. However, Gus's transition journey also reveals the many challenges involved and the persistence and creativity required to keep going successfully. Gus is a very likable, active man with intellectual disability now in his early 30s. He's very socially engaged and has a well-developed circle of friends and community activities independent of his family. He also enjoys activities with his family. Nowadays, he lives by himself in one of 11 scattered apartments, each housing individuals with disability in a complex of about 200 apartments, where the remaining apartments are just housing people from the general community. A disability support service provides shared part-time support to each person with disability, including Gus. So this is the story about how Gus got to where he is living today. You can see on screen there some information about his background and education and transition experience. And after graduating school, he went to a transition program for several years while still living at home with family. But Gus and his family wanted to figure out how Gus could have his own apartment and thrive beyond his parents' lifespan. And I think there's a very important lesson here, and that's to start planning early and not wait for a crisis to develop where there's an urgent need for alternative accommodation outside of the family. And Kathy mentioned that, quote, "I think it would help families to have a vision for what they want their son or daughter in their own apartment. Also, it helps not to overthink the situation. We didn't have all the I's dotted or the T's crossed, but enough things lined up with the first roommate that it was worth trying." So in other words, Gus and his family took the initiative. With help from a county case manager here in Minnesota, Gus got some disability funding. And again, quoting Kathy, "We were told Gus likely wouldn't qualify for 24-hour support, So we started off with a roommate model. And I'll explain a bit more about that as we go along. And I think on reflection, the lack of 24-hour funding was frankly a blessing in disguise. There's lots of research, and Gus's experience supports this, that shows that people with part-time paid support are much more independent and more self-determined. This is absolutely true for Gus. So I think, thinking creatively, that not being stuck in the idea of paid staff supported living arrangements is the only option, but looking beyond existing models, in this case to the roommate model. So in his mid-20s, Gus moved into his own 2-bedroom apartment with a roommate without disability. The apartment was within walking distance of his parents' home, and in Gus's words, quote, "My first apartment was on Grand Avenue, super close to my parents' home." And in hindsight, I think this was a good choice because it was a very familiar neighbourhood for Gus that allowed him to easily keep his social connections, his family support, and to use familiar places for shopping, travel and the like. And being close by, I think, likely reduced his parents' anxiety, which is also important. His first apartment was well located for public transportation, for shopping, entertainment and other services, providing many opportunities for Gus to increase his independence. However, what I've said so far makes it sound straightforward, but there were in fact significant difficulties that needed to be overcome. Renting a nice 2-bedroom apartment was difficult because Gus didn't meet the income or credit history requirements. Fortunately, they were helped by a rental manager who herself had personal involvement in disability. And she pointed out that the rental company had a policy that instead of meeting the credit history and income criteria, you could pay the rent 1 year up front. So Gus's parents paid that, and Gus and Riley, his first roommate, paid it back through regular monthly payments that first year. Over the 7 years that Gus lived in this first apartment, Gus had 6 different roommates. These are all male, as it happened, and there's people without disability. Most worked out well, and Gus remains in contact with all but one of these roommates. But over time, finding suitable roommates was an ongoing challenge that Gus and his family dealt with in a variety of ways. Riley, Gus's first roommate at Grand Avenue, Gus met at the Twins, which is a professional baseball team here in Minnesota, and where Gus worked, and Riley was a co-worker, and they became friends, and that led to Riley becoming Gus's first roommate. Later on, they found 2 roommates through a university, but the universities in the Twin Cities stopped allowing private individuals to advertise jobs. So over time, that avenue became much more difficult. Relatively recently, in the last couple of years, I think it began actually during COVID, a new roommate matching service came out, an online matching service called Rumi, R-U-M-I. And I think there's a link in the article in Impact to that service if people are interested in checking that out. And Gus and Kathy reported that they had 2 very good interviews with young men who were potential roommates, but those 2 ended up doing other things, partly because of issues related to COVID. And in the light of increasing difficulties in locating suitable roommates, they eventually concluded that after 7 good years, finding a roommate was not a sustainable model in their case, although it worked very well for a number of years. As Gus put it, quote, "Me and my mum were kind of having a problem finding roommates," unquote. And I mentioned the challenges. And I think it's important to recognise that having your own home with a roommate is not a set and forget option for Gus and his family. For example, Kathy mentioned that regarding the roommate's pay for the specific paid support that the roommate gave Gus, Kathy mentioned, quote, I had to sign off on it to verify the hours. So I ended up as a kind of manager myself. Turning to Gus's life today, Gus explained why he likes to shop for groceries independently. This is a longish quote, but I think it gives a great flavour of what a delightful man Gus is. And Gus says, sometimes I go with Zach, a support worker, to the grocery store. Sometimes I like to go on my own. They're not always available when I want to go. Or sometimes I have to hear from them why don't I get something healthy? I do some of the time. I get healthy things, like I love sushi, and that's healthy. Plus, if I see somebody at the grocery store, which happens a lot, and in fact, I ran into Gus in the grocery store myself yesterday, so his words were quite prophetic. Gus says, I don't have to be on a schedule or have the staff say, well, we're sort of on a schedule. And most people shop on their own. They don't go with people. I like to go on my own. So in conclusion, as you can hear from my accent, I come from Australia, although I'm working here in the US currently, and I've seen the occasional similar success stories like Gus's in Australia, but they remain rare. So I think it's really helpful to share these stories because they provide role models and show what's possible. So, I really thank Gus and Kathy for doing just that. And it's clear that all the work and planning that they did extended long beyond the formal transition period that ends at age 22 when people finish their formal transition programs. And frankly, the formal transition program had a limited amount to do with Gus's getting his own apartment. And Gus and his family were really the key players in Gus's success in my judgment. I started this presentation by mentioning the issue of low expectations and raising expectations. And I'd urge you to hang in for the length of our presentation today, because the second last presentation is a video from Australia from my colleagues Michelle Brotherton and Phil Tuckerman at Job Support, talking about their transition service, transition to work, and it's entitled Raising Expectations, and they do a marvellous job in achieving that, and I warmly recommend that presentation to you as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Roger. And is Andy Traub with us? I think he might have had a conflict today. So I think we're going to go right to Kelly Hess.
Yeah, then I just.
Okay, do you want to do that first? Or?
No, that's fine.
Okay. So Kelly is a program coordinator for the Utah School to Work Interagency Transition Initiative at the Institute for Disability Research Policy and Practice in Logan, Utah. And it was a delight to have Kelly and her co-author, Faith Thomas, really step us through the School to Work Initiative program that she ran. This was what we call a how-to article in Impact, and that's where we really dig into the specific steps that some of our authors take in some of these programs to get something underway. And so it was really great to hear about braided funding and how they made that work. So Kelly, if you're with us, do you want to take it from there? And Renata, did you want to say something first though?
Yeah, I just wanted to interject. I also wanted to acknowledge, because Kelly works closely with Tim Reason at Utah State University. Tim is also a partner together with Aubrey on our transition project here in Minnesota. And I think Tim was on Zoom. I'm not sure if he's still there. So I just wanted to make sure I make that acknowledgement. So thank you. Go ahead, Kelly.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. In 2016, Utah was awarded a Partnerships in Employment grant from the Administration of Community Living. And the grant was to focus on creating systems change efforts in employment. So myself and a colleague, Trisha Jones Parkin, we created the Utah School to Work Interagency Transition Initiative. And although in Utah there were positive efforts being made to connect transition age students with intellectual and developmental disabilities to employment services, we were seeing that students with more significant disabilities who needed a higher level of support, they were falling through a gap and were more often than not, were not being linked to employment services or even considered for competitive integrated employment. So we wanted to use the Partnerships in Employment grant to address this need. We identified that students with significant support needs would benefit best from an alternative path to employment. So customized employment it takes an individualized approach to exploring employment. And one of the fundamental elements of customized employment is a process called discovery. And discovery is a flexible process that identifies individuals' strengths, their contributions, and the conditions where they will be the most successful. So within the School to Work initiative, we implemented the model of customized employment for participating students. So from 2016 to 2022, we established and supported 10 project demonstration sites that consisted of multi-agency teams that really work together to link students to services that would give them the widest array of opportunities. And those teams coordinated employment services, specifically customized employment. So these teams, these multi-agency teams, members included special educators that knew the students well, vocational rehabilitation counselors, community rehabilitation providers, workforce innovation and opportunity aptitude counselors, support coordinators if the student had one, and other supports just kind of on more of an individual basis, depending on the students. And these teams met together on a regular basis to share information about the students that they were supporting and to really work to make sure that they were solidly linked to services among each of those agencies. And sharing information between the educator and the employment specialist provider was especially impactful, as the provider oversaw the customized employment and discovery process, but it often is the educator that really knows the student well, has worked with them for several years, and is able to share information that's really helpful for helping the provider to get started on customized employment. So during the span of this initiative, 108 students benefited from coordinated services from the multi-agency teams. And across these 10 teams, team members unanimously agreed that on the benefits of sharing information and collaborating to best serve the students. And graded funding was a key element to the work that multi-agency teams were engaged in. And although it required additional coordination from the team members, by utilizing the financial resources from multiple agencies and programs that, of course, the students were found eligible for, students had more opportunities available to them as they prepared for and pursued competitive integrated employment. So that was just kind of the the key of it is really making sure that we weren't missing resources that students were eligible for. And if they were eligible, then we wanted to take advantage of that instead of just working in silos. We wanted to make sure that we were accessing all that was available and really braiding the resources. So the braiding of funding allowed for simultaneous access to services from vocational rehabilitation, WIOA youth programs, through workforce services, the services that employment specialists provided, and independent living centers. And this, again, this braiding just really provided a broad range of services and opportunities so students could access what was needed and what was appropriate for them. And this created the highest chances, not only for successful employment outcomes, but it really started them on a path to a meaningful career. And through this initiative, we were able to work with 9 different school districts and develop the 10 multi-agency teams, but we wanted to create a resource for schools and teams beyond just those 10. So we wanted to share information on how to replicate the Utah School to Work Transition Initiative. So we were able to create an online toolkit that shares strategies and best practices for developing partnerships with disability-related agencies to coordinate employment-focused services. In the toolkit, it really kind of outlines the different agencies that could be partnering with each other and what their role within an interagency team could look like. And through the last 6 years of this initiative, there's been many lessons learned and some systemic challenges identified. And the article shares a few recommendations, including just coordinating employment services earlier than the students' last 2 years of school and increasing the speed of the eligibility process for services that would support students in pursuing community employment. And many of you have spoken about, the impact of expectations. And that, again, was something that we strongly identified, that the need for expectations for people with disabilities, but particularly for people who do need a higher level of support to be successful, was definitely something that we identified, and we're trying to build strategies to address. I don't know how my time is going, but if there is time, then I'd be happy to take any questions. And if anyone's interested, I can drop the link for the toolkit into the chat so that you guys can access it if you would like to take a look at it.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. The link would be great. And we do have time for one question for Kelly. All right. So if no questions are there, so it's a great pleasure now to introduce Safia Doctor, who she and I co-wrote an article for Impact, but Safia is going to do the presentation. Safia, as a matter of fact, was a student in Brian and my class in the spring semester on disability and development. And she is an amazing young woman who has been doing a lot of work in connection to the war with Ukraine. And she is going to present on her perspective of transition in Ukraine and potentially some other additional pieces that you want to share.
Yes,
So thank you.
So much, Anna.
Yes, so I will be talking about the war in Ukraine and how it relates to the article. So in many countries around the world, people with disabilities have been neglected. Unfortunately, Ukraine was one of those countries as well, not because the people lacked compassion, but unfortunately, the hard reality was prioritizing those with disabilities was not the primary issue of the country due to many people experiencing poverty, decades of pain due to government corruption, war, genocide, and famine. Due to Russia's war, the lives of an estimated 2.7 million Ukrainians with disabilities are at risk. It is important to note that many people in Ukraine are not registered as having a disability, especially those who are not living in major cities such as Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Lviv. Therefore, those numbers only portray the absolute minimum. At least 200,000 of the estimated 2.7 million people are mostly children who live in institutions that already struggle with daily resources despite Russia's war. Many others live in post-Soviet apartment buildings that are being bombed daily, trapping those with limited mobility in their homes. For some, medication is needed to survive. For those with disabilities, leaving is not always an option due to limited transportation, road blockage, shelling, and being physically trapped in bomb shelters and under debris from shelled residential buildings. For the families who can escape, the journey to leave their city is long, even those who do not face a disability. The Russian military not only prevents humanitarian corridors from entering, resulting in the inability to receive medication, water, food, feminine products, and other essential aid, but also is kidnapping Ukrainian children from orphanages and institutions to transport them onto Russian territory. They burn their documents in Ukraine, leaving them with no traceable identity to be found or, unfortunately, sometimes remembered. As the war progresses, life for children with disabilities becomes more and more difficult. Children with disabilities are at greater risk of being internally displaced, trapped in institutions, and abandoned. Resources are limited, but parents do wait in long lines to try and get essential supplies for their children. Children's health is declining each day because they do not have their medication, regular doctor visits, or food, water, and their routine that they need to stay healthy. Evacuation plans are typically not designed to be accessible for those with disabilities, which makes it impossible to reach metro stations and bomb shelters, especially when having limited mobility. It is also very difficult to navigate all the information being presented and emergency evacuations, especially those with sensory impairments, such as blind and those who are deaf. There are organizations that are helping children with disabilities, but the reality is that there is a huge lack of transition services for youth with disabilities in Ukraine before the war and right now. In our article, Transition in a Time of Crisis, we talk more in depth about this. Because there are no established transition services for youth with disabilities in Ukraine, and any informal support that families may have received has been refocused on simply surviving the war. We are so beyond grateful for the countries who have been able to provide support, such as Poland, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic. So when a disaster breaks out, those whose voice is not as heard typically suffer the most. Our hearts also go out to the children in Iran, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, and the dozen other countries where children with disabilities are not protected. We hope to come up with a program to help children with disabilities, not only in Ukraine, but in every other country who currently do not have transitional services, especially during war or a crisis. A child is a child in every country, regardless of the politics. When a child is screaming out for help, you listen. It's just that simple. There is honestly nothing complicated about that. We as adults need to help them. The people sitting in this room are the ones who already know that, right? We are all being the advocates for the children. The people who we need to be reaching out to are the ones who are not sitting in this room. So I hope that we can do that and we are able to help those children. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. And would you mind sharing a little bit of what you shared with me based on the article that you got some contact?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I was contacted by a student at the University of Minnesota who has read the article. and her mom is currently a elementary school teacher in the Minneapolis Public School District. And she had a refugee from Ukraine who is 5 years old, who doesn't speak any English, and it was her first time in the US. So I've been able to work with her right now and translate and just kind of get her situated, especially because schools in Ukraine are much different than schools in the US, and there are different rules, and children don't know that. And if they have 3 snacks in Ukraine and they don't have snack time in the US, a child could think that they're being like punished because they're not getting the food that they need, but really it's just a different system. So working with her has been really an honor, honestly. Yes.
And about the manual?
Oh, yes. Also, the teacher had a great idea to start a manual for educators, specifically right now in the US, to state those differences. So they are able to read the manual, follow it, and figure out why a child might be acting the way that they are. It might not be because they are traumatized because of the war in Ukraine, but just because it's a huge cultural shock to not only go to school for the first time, but in another country as well. So currently I'm going to be trying to create that document. Yes. Yes, okay,
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sophia. Yeah, so, this just, so every time I talk to Sophia and others in similar situation, I realize the transition itself is a very difficult and tumultuous topic. But if you think about transition in countries like Ukraine, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, we are talking about a totally different dimension that we must not forget about. So with that, I know we are running a little bit ahead of schedule. I hope Satomi is online. I believe so. I can see her photo. Okay, great. So Satomi, although she's a professor at University of Wisconsin River Falls in special education, she will be talking about Japan, her home country, and a transition the transition initiative that's happening there based on a common project we have together, but also from her own experience and expertise. So go ahead, Satomi.
Thank you. Well, good morning and good afternoon. Well, thank you for having me for this exciting, international forum. I wrote this article for Impact, the innovative approaches to transition as for the Japanese perspective, with Takeshi Chikurinji. He's a special education professor of the Hiroshima Cosmopolitan University, who couldn't be here with me today. I'm going to be sharing his brief video clip, recorded later. So hopefully I can just, play that from my computer. Well, first I wanted to mention that from the cultural perspective of Japan, which focuses on collectivism, meaning that the emphasis is society, group, and the community over individual needs and wants. So traditionally, people with disabilities in Japan used to work in segregated places, such as day programs, workshops, just for people with disabilities and their supervisors, just like here in the US. But with the influence from the American and more global perspectives, like the adoption of the CRPD by the United Nations, so Japan has been working toward creating more inclusive society for people with and without disabilities both for the last couple of decades. Japan has similar special education system like the US, meaning the many students with disabilities spending majority of their time in regular classrooms with their cohorts and being pulled out for special education services for the core curriculum courses often. Japan has several special schools we call special needs education schools in each city. And usually those schools are for students with intellectual disabilities, and some separate schools for students with physical, hearing and visual impairments. And we look at transition as the entire developmental phases for all school-age students with disabilities. So we consider transition as career education as the equivalent meaning. And we perceive that career and the career education put focuses on the community and working as a group and a team, because of the collectivism, as I mentioned. So younger students, elementary students start to explore different types of career in the community at early stages. Then secondary students, start to learn about different jobs through work-based learning in the community to prepare for their transition into their adulthood. About 30% of students with disabilities graduated from special needs education high schools in Japan get employment right after their graduation. But over 60% of them transition into social welfare programs to prepare for their employment, communications, and independent living skills. And usually those programs are funded by the local governments. So to improve transition career education, for students with disabilities in Japan, schools have been using newer approaches to help them, especially for their employment. So schools have been building partnerships with local, like small to medium-sized businesses in the communities for work-based learning. And some students successfully get employed after graduating. Some schools have been working with large-scale businesses, and actually many of them are like international scale businesses to develop partnerships for their students with disabilities. And also, Japan has a unique system called special subsidiaries that are part of the large-scale companies or holdings that employ only people with disabilities and their job coaches and some administrators. Even though they're part of the big companies or holdings, they can often create employment opportunities for people with disabilities kind of away from the rest of the parent company. So sometimes there has been a debate over inclusivity of these types of special subsidiaries, but some progressive international companies in Japan have created more inclusive environment for their employees with and without disabilities, meaning that they created jobs for people with disabilities, within their parent company locations, such as like cleaning, custodial or data entry using computers, etc. And that is actually what we really, aim toward, as more inclusive society. And also in education, schools and educators have been employing more student-centered approaches in transition career education by using different strategies, such as dialogue-based learning and inquiry learning. Well, dialogue-based learning, facilitates more dialogues, between students, teachers and other educational staff and supervisors or clients, at their work-based learning sites. And inquiry-based learning, promotes students exploring, their interests, helping their generating questions and investigating answers. So these approaches to transition and career education in Japan add sort of newer perspectives to the traditional idea about, employment for people with disabilities and more inclusive society. So I want to share a short video clip recorded earlier by my co-presenter, Chikurinji, and hope the technology works okay. And I'll be translating as he speaks in Japanese.
広島都市学園大学の竹林寺です。今日は皆さんにお目にかかれませんが、どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。日本の近年の知的障害のある生徒のキャリア教育について 3つの動きを紹介します。私はキャリア教育とは、生徒の自分らしさを発揮して社会に貢献したいという生徒を育む教育だと考えています。1つ目は、地域との共同による
So I like to talk about, three things related to career education and special education in Japan. We think career education is about promoting students with disabilities just being themselves, and also their idea about, being contributing to society.
キャリア教育です。地域が学校の教育活動に協力し、生徒が地域に貢献する活動が実施されています。例えば、学校の授業で学んだ清掃のスキルを生かして、生徒が市役所を清掃すること、学校に食堂を開設して、生徒が調理した食事やパン、コーヒーなどを地域住民に提供することです。生徒は効力感や有能感を実感しています。
So the first theme is about collaboration with the local community, with schools. So for example, students, learn cleaning or custodial skills, and sometimes, they go out to local city halls and then they use their skills. Sometimes, they create, cafeteria within their school, and they actually learn cooking skills, and actually offer, for example, like coffee and, other, baked goods for the local residents. So they actually build, more self-worth and also self-esteem through this service.
2つ目は、対話することが生徒のキャリア発達を促すために重要であるということに気づき、多様な他者との対話を設定するようになったことです。例えば、食堂を利用する地域住民に対して生徒が説明し、質問される活動が設定されています。対話の中で生徒がなぜ、何のためにを考えることが促されています。
So the second theme is about, like I said earlier, dialogue-based type of learning. So through offering the services, like in the cafeterias at school, students get to have conversation, with local residents, who visit schools, and they can actually explain about, how the system works and, how they are working at the cafeteria, so that students can learn, why they work, through the communications with local people visiting the school.
3つ目は、卒業生との対話で、夢や憧れを育む活動が広がっていることです。卒業生が働いている会社を生徒が訪問し、インタビューしたことを冊子にまとめた学校があります。卒業生へのインタビューです。会社の上司に対するインタビューです。
So the third thing related to, dialogue-based learning. So students get to have, more opportunities to have dialogues, conversation with, for example, people working in the community, and also their graduates from, special needs education high schools, those with disabilities. So some of them had an opportunity to interview their graduates working in the community, and they put them together as a journal like he was showing.
最近、学校と地域の共同は新しい広がりを見せています。例えば、地域住民と学校が地震に備えた避難訓練を一緒にし、避難所の運営を生徒がボランティアとして手伝うなどです。以上で終わります。
Oh, okay. So lastly, okay. So lastly, yeah, the collaboration with schools, you know, have been spreading in, you know, in Japan. And for example, you know, Japan has been known for example, like earthquakes and the other natural disasters. But, you know, students with disabilities, you know, they created opportunities to actually help out community to work as volunteers, so they can be prepared for, you know, those type of natural disasters for the community. So, you know, beyond employment, they have opportunities to just collaborate with, you know, community. So yeah, that has been the new approaches in Japan. So yeah, I hope my timing was okay. And if I have time, yeah, I'm happy to answer questions. If not, yeah, please feel free to email me. I'll answer questions.
Yeah, so we have time maybe for one question for Sakome. All right, if not, so Brian is going to, on behalf of the guest editors of the issue, he's going to kind of provide a summary. And then we have 2 recordings, one from Australia, one from New Zealand. And then we will conclude our combined portion before lunch. So Brian.
Thank you, Renata. What I'm going to talk a little about today is what we thought was really necessary to think about if we're going to move toward modernizing transition, bringing it into the 21st century. You know, and I think this all starts with whether it's a country, whether it's a state, whether it's a school district, having a framework for transition, a framework that focuses on 21st century skills, a framework which is comprehensive and is supported by a consensus among all stakeholders, and a framework which is culturally responsive. In the United States, we have incredibly diverse communities, and all too often we make the mistake that every community is looking for the same outcomes and views transition, disability, self-determination, and employment in the same way, where we have found that that's not necessarily the case. The second thing that we thought about and discussed was the need to have a framework which is based upon a social ecological approach that doesn't just focus on individuals with disabilities, but focuses on both the strengths those individuals bring to the table and the context in which those students, those young adults, are going to school and the communities in which they live. If we don't take into consideration the context, you know, we start having problems with expecting transition services and supports and outcomes to be the same whether a student is living in rural Montana or Alaska, or in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, or in, you know, an intensive urban area like New York or Los Angeles. And that context of the contextual factors are so important for us to take into consideration. Now, regardless of the context, you know, those outcomes we believe that are, you know, set forth in our state of Minnesota's new framework are the outcomes we really need to be focusing on. And, you know, our group here at the Institute on Community Integration is really excited about the release of this transition framework, because we think it's really going to get schools working with the community, with families, with young adults with disabilities to focus on, you know, integrated, you know, competitive employment, you know, entry into post-secondary education, not just entry into, but successful graduation from, individuals leading self-determined lives, and individuals leading the types of lives that they desire, being not just living in the community, but being of the community. Now, all of that really requires a framework to be person-centered. A recent conversation that we had just before we wrote this article with a parent, you know, suggested that for her, transition all too often is like an individual entering into a cul-de-sac. You know, you enter from one point, you go around and around and around, in some cases for 3, 4, or 5 years, and then you come out at the same point that you entered. And, you know, what we thought about was, you know, what is a metaphor for a more appropriate, more successful transition? And because they are installing traffic circles, rotaries, roundabouts all over Minnesota at this time, it came to mind that this might be a much better metaphor to use for transition. So you enter that traffic circle, that roundabout, and there are multiple ways you can exit it. And for us, the decision as to where the individual is going to exit, what path they are going to take, is something that needs to lie within that young adult with a disability, with support from their family. And our frameworks need to be flexible enough so that they can be person-centered, shift gears when necessary, because after going around that roundabout a couple of times, a young adult may decide they want a different path than they originally thought they were going to have when they went in. A fourth factor that we considered, based upon both our thinking as we wrote this article and our interactions with school districts around Minnesota, as we have worked through our Administration on Community Living Project of National Significance on transition, is that schools need to have a way to evaluate the effectiveness of the transition supports and services they're providing. I'm not talking about at a state level or a national level. I'm talking about schools having kind of within their toolkit, you know, the ability to evaluate both formatively when students are still in a transition program or getting transition services, whether the supports they're providing are leading to intended outcomes, and summatively, you know, so that they know what happens to students after they leave the program. Far too many schools we have talked to have said that once a student leaves the school district, unless they come back to visit their old teachers, we never hear from them again. And we really don't know what types of outcomes they experience. And I think as part of that, you know, one of the things that we really need to focus on is demonstrating the utility of these services, you know, making sure that parents know that, you know, having their young adult with a disability take part in transition is going to have potentially a profound impact on the outcomes that they experience later in life. And to pick up on something that Ross said, you know, those frameworks need to be focused on high expectations, reasonable and expected outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. So we will, luckily our timing is good. We will play the 2 recordings because the people who were not be able to be on Zoom in person, their timing is just not right. Australia and New Zealand are in the middle of their night right now. That's why the recordings. So we'll play those and then we'll just briefly conclude, and for those of us here, we'll have lunch.
Renata, this is Roger. While you're working on these technical glitches, I just wanted to add a comment to Brian's last point about evaluating individual outcomes of transition programs. Some work I did a couple of years ago in Australia on transition to work programs in New South Wales, the state that Sydney is in Australia. We found incredible variability between different programs in achieving employment outcomes for the graduates of these so-called transition to work programs, with some of the programs over a 5-year period having none of their clients achieve employment on graduation, whereas others had outcomes as high as 70% of people at graduation achieving employment. So I think in addition to the point about overall evaluation of outcomes, it's important for people with disability and families to have information about specific individual programs and how well or poorly they're doing in relation to outcomes of interest to the family.
Hello, I'm Jack Beard. Where do you work, Jake? At Downlights, and I make candles.
Right. And I'm Tracy, and this is Terry. We are Jack's proud parents. Jack has come a long way, and his journey has been helped by wonderful, caring people along the way. Even going back to his school years, when if he was given an opportunity to build a relationship with someone, using compassion and humour and a desire to understand what makes Jack tick, people generally got the best out of him. And the same has happened where he is now. Leading up to Jack's final years at school, we attended a few transition expos held here in Auckland where we live, and they helped give us the right connections to possible work experience opportunities for Jack, supported work experience opportunities. His first work experience opportunity didn't work, and it was a great learning experience for us because it helped us understand what was going to work and what definitely wasn't. Your first work experience, Jack, what didn't work for you the most? Can you remember what didn't work the most for you in your first work experience?
Lots of people.
Lots of people, yeah. It was a bit crowded. There were a lot of people, yeah. And then after that, we already had a connection with an organisation called Recreate New Zealand, and they've always provided Jack with outings and social connections, but they also have a transition program called MOXIE, which stands for Meaningful Opportunities that Cross Over into Employment. So it was through Recreate New Zealand that we had an opportunity to have a work experience for Jack at Downlights, who make beautiful candles. But along the way, before leading up to that, Recreate helped Jack develop some life skills that would help his work experience, such as catching the bus and the train. They also transported Jack to Downlights for his work experience. And the Downlights opportunity definitely suited Jack, and it still suits Jack. Downlights provide work experience for people with Down syndrome and intellectual disabilities. At Downlights, straight away, Jack felt supported, and he felt like it was a family away from home. He always felt valued, and now he's definitely able to achieve a lot of the jobs at Downlights with their support. He feels like he's allowed to make mistakes, and he's constantly told he's amazing. He's well guided and encouraged by his supervisors there, and the manager Jennifer there. Jack feels the world a lot differently to the rest of us, but at Downlights he's been nurtured, and his abilities have been nurtured and identified, and they've had a flexibility around finding out what works best for Jack and how to get the best out of him. Would you agree with that, Jack?
Yes.
Yeah. What's the one thing you really love at Downlights? Or that you feel like you really enjoy at Downlights? Pouring. What do you pour?
Pour candles.
Yeah. Are you pretty good at pouring candles?
Yes.
Yeah. Have you got a special name at Downlights for your candle pouring?
Jack the Minuteman.
Oh, so is that because you're pretty quick at pouring candles?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, well done. Yeah. And Terry, you've got anything to add?
Yeah, I think if we talk about Jack's experience or Jack's journey into employment, he's been quite lucky that we were in the right place at the right time for him to be introduced to working at Downlights. And the thing about Jack is that he can be productive and he can work, and it's economic to employ Jack, but you just have to take more time to show him what to do, and you have to take your time to encourage him and explain to him how well he's doing, and he will grow and do better. And there are not a lot of employers who are prepared to make that sort of commitment early on. And that's where Jack has been very lucky with his employment at Downlights.
Yes. You agree, Jack?
Yes.
Yeah. So we're very proud of you, aren't we? And we absolutely love all the candles that you pour. What's your favourite candle, Jack?
Fragrance. What's your
What
favourite?
Coconut and fig.
Coconut and fig. Makes you want to eat the candle, doesn't it? All right. Thank you, everybody.
Bye now.
Bye now.
So our last video is from the folks at Job Support Transition in Australia.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today about Job Support's transition program that supports school leavers with intellectual disability go from school into work. I'll be providing some background information on the program, interspersed with some video footage featuring previous transition clients who've gone into employment. And later Phil will talk about employment outcomes data and its importance for understanding what works for different disability groups. Job Support is an Australian disability employment service that specialises in supporting people with moderate intellectual disability to gain and maintain jobs in open employment that are matched to both their needs and the needs of the employer. We operate two services, an open employment service that began in 1986 and a transition to work service that began as a pilot in 1997. In America and Europe, the open employment service we run would be termed supported employment. Our transition to work service is for school leavers who have been assessed as needing additional post-school service support before undertaking employment. In Australia, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, the NDIS, funds these supports, which are labelled school leaver employment supports. Funding is typically available for eligible individuals in their final year of school and is provided for up to 2 years. School leaver supports are delivered by non-government providers who are external to the school system. Now, NDIS participants who have this funding choose their provider or providers from those available in their area. Job Support operates in the 3 largest cities in Australia, Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, where there are many providers to choose from. The model of support offered in the Job Support Transition Program is based on our employment program and aligns with what research has identified as necessary components of employment support for people with intellectual disability. Here is a brief introduction video on job customisation in employment.
The term job customisation refers to creating a job that has been negotiated for a specific client and varies significantly from the usual job description. Prior to the 1986 Disability Services Act, people with a moderate intellectual disability didn't achieve open employment. As recently as 2013, an evaluation of disability employment services found that one service, Job Support, was responsible for 72% of the 26-week employment outcomes for people with a moderate intellectual disability, working 15+ hours per week.
People with a moderate intellectual disability require a different approach. The transformational change was a movement away from assessing what people couldn't do that was presumed necessary for a standard job description. The more successful approach is to focus on what the person can do and then negotiate a job that's built around what they can do and meets both their needs and the needs of the employer.
First, set up meeting room.
Alex is a person with a moderate intellectual disability who lives at home with his family. He's been employed at Steadfast, a large insurance brokerage firm, since July 2019. He works 16 hours a week as an office assistant.
So teaching skills that won't be needed in a customised job is a waste of the client's time. Worse is teaching skills that the person with an intellectual disability can't master and reinforces low self-belief and in fact risks them never being seen as ready for employment.
The Rehabilitation Research and Training Centre at Virginia Commonwealth University and the Centre for Disability Studies at Sydney University conducted a worldwide literature review to identify any articles or studies over the last 50 years that included data on what works to achieve open employment outcomes for people with an intellectual disability. The literature identified 4 key components that all need to be present for successful job placement and retention. An assessment process that focuses on the client's strengths. Job search and job customisation to create a job that meets a genuine need for the employer, whilst also matching the client's strengths and job preference. Systematic on-the-job instruction based on applied behaviour analysis theory. And ongoing support to meet the changing needs of clients and employers. Whilst the literature is clear that these components are all critical, it does not provide information about which approach is best within each component. Hands-on investigation is needed to document the approaches used by the services achieving the best outcomes for different populations.
The Job Support Transition Service takes a different approach to work preparation than most. Rather than having a curriculum or teaching generic skills deemed necessary for employment, the program raises expectations of what the person can achieve through customised long-term work experience placements, with each placement being up to 6 months in duration. Most Job Support Transition clients begin engaging with us in their final year of school, where we work with them, their family and school teachers to identify their interests and goals, as well as any barriers to succeeding in employment. This assessment process covers both employment and transition programs and includes half-day work trials. Typically, the assessment and planning of the individual program occurs while they're still at school, and they actually commence activity once they've finished school at around 18 years of age. The following brief video highlights how this is a transition for both the client and their family.
Dad? I'm going to work now.
When we first set up Job Support, it worked quite well, but we only had fairly limited numbers of people coming into the program.
See ya. Work hard. I will. Have fun.
The reason we set up the Transition to Work pilot was really to get other people who weren't considering that employment was possible to come to us. What Transition to Work's done is dramatically increase the number of people prepared to attempt open employment.
I can't even think of what we were thinking, what she's going to do after school. I never thought that we could find a job.
It was a time of uncertainty. We aspired to have Kate achieve her best, but we were unsure about the best path to do that.
One of the major barriers that young people have coming out of school is the fact that their families and school teachers alike tend to have very low expectations of their potential.
You're doing a fabulous job. Thanks, Freya.
Even in terms of their travel, only 43% of the young people who left school last year were actually able to travel.
I guess in terms of the travel training, that was a concern. I think it's a concern for most parents.
I get on a bus and a train and drive to work.
They started her training for her to go alone from here to the train station, then train station to home. Then they started her training in the train, going to Parramatta, then to the city.
To move from, yes, she started a travel train, but then to be able to catch the bus, get on a train and get to Central in the city. Wow, going back a year ago, we couldn't imagine that Kate would have got through that.
The main thing that a Transition to Work program does is it lets people with a moderate intellectual disability experience success.
Morning, Kate. Morning, Kate.
And that success lifts their self-esteem, it lifts their expectations, and then they're prepared to attempt open employment.
As indicated in the video, travel training to the person's selected work experience site is the first step. The video saying 43% of school leavers coming to our program left school without independent travel was done several years ago, but the figure is roughly the same each year. Once they can travel to work experience independently, the individual plan targets any other barriers to succeeding in employment that may have been identified during the assessment process. We aim for clients to obtain a job through the employment program as soon as possible and within the 2 years of the school leaver employment supports funding. Job Support Transition trainers use systematic instruction with error-free training to teach clients to perform work experience tasks in a work environment where supervision and workplace social interaction is provided by worksite supervisors and co-workers. Just like they would in the employment program, the transition trainer fades their presence from the work experience site as the client becomes independent in the tasks and expectations of the role and program goals are achieved. Once the client is working independently, the trainer still provides regular support visits to monitor progress, provide any additional training, and to work through any changes or issues that have arisen. The key purpose of the placements is for the client to experience success in real work settings. However, work experience placements also provide a valuable context to learn more about the client's strengths and interests, for informed choice about work, and for understanding the conditions likely to contribute to a successful job for them. In June 2020, prior to COVID impacts, Job Support Transition had open employment outcome rates of 65.5%, meaning almost 2/3 of clients who were assessed as not ready for employment at the time they left school achieved open employment after participating in the program. Consistent with the job support approach to job search, these jobs would be stable, ongoing employment in customised roles of 15 hours or more per week. The link between our transition service and open employment service is critical in achieving these outcomes, as without an effective employment service that has the expertise to provide support for people with intellectual disability and higher support needs, these school leavers can be prepared for work but still have no access to it. All providers of school leaver employment supports are required to report to the NDIS on the amount and type of supports provided to each individual participant, and details of any employment outcomes achieved. This data has not yet been made publicly available for stakeholders to compare services by outcomes. In December of 2017, the Australian Government published the results of every service in Australia by type of disability. They published the proportion of people who got a job and the proportion of those jobs that lasted 52 weeks. 67.2% of job support clients, people who entered the service, achieved a job that lasted at least 52 weeks. The next best in the country was 37.6%, and the national average was 23.1%.
As of February 2020, pre-COVID, Job Support was supporting 837 people in jobs. They worked an average of 20 hours a week. They earned an average of $408, and they'd been in their current job for an average of 7.7 years. Now, I mention those results not to big note as job support, but to suggest that something better is possible in terms of open employment results for people with an intellectual disability. Job support was evaluated by the funding department as part of a broader evaluation of disability employment services. There was a chapter in the review that dealt specifically with intellectual disability, and it can be found on Job Support's What Works website. It's titled An Evaluation of Moderate Intellectual Disability Loading. That evaluation and another one we commissioned by Virginia Commonwealth University both credited Job Support's better results to its adherence to evidence-based practice. Over the years, you see a lot of good ideas about what works come and go, and typically there's always a few good examples of how they worked. The problem we have is that we find a lot of good ideas don't scale up. We think there's an opportunity to identify the best performing services in Australia using government data, and then to document what those services are doing and to disseminate it by type of disability. We think three things would flow from that. Firstly, providers would know what the best services are doing. Now, that doesn't mean they can't improve on that, but at least they would know what's currently working fairly well. Secondly, people with a disability would know what's currently working fairly well. That doesn't mean they can't choose something different, but at least they should have that information so they can make an informed choice. And thirdly, those services, once identified, could be used by government as lighthouses against which to test any new policy or funding variations.
I like my job, and the people are nice, kind, and hopeful. If I need help, they help me.
How was your weekend, Freya? Good. Yours? It's good. Yeah, it was great. Thanks. Did you go shopping?
She goes shopping herself. On days off, on weekends she goes. And we are really like, sometimes we're scared, how you gonna, she said, no, I can go. So we are really thankful like what she's gained from job support.
Kate, like any young person, needed to find her way and find what she enjoyed. Yeah, it's been life-changing for Kate and for us.
For more information on job support transition and the What Works page of our website, please go to www.jobsupport.org.au.
Right, well, it's been a long morning. Thank you, everybody. So we've gone around the world, from Bhutan to Kenya, Ethiopia, Japan, Ukraine, Canada, and I guess, just the question I think we should leave with is, are there more differences or similarities between the transition programs, what we can learn from each other, not just from the so-called developed countries, but also countries in the global south. So thank you very much. And I'm sure we'll talk to you soon.